The year is 1995, and the great house still rises from the cliffs above the sea, but it is now deserted and in ruins. It is here, 25 years into the future, that Barnabas and Julia find themselves after their escape from parallel time, searching to discover the causes of the devastation and of the terror at Collinwood. There's nowhere to run, there's no place to hide. This podcast is fun, but there are spoilers inside. Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. I am your hostess, Danielle, aka Penny Dreadful, and I am very excited to have my friend here today, Raymond Castile. Hi, Ray. Raymond is a YouTube creator, writer, filmmaker, actor, monster collector, and musician who hosts and produces the amazing Raymond Castile's Basement of Horror YouTube channel, which features an in-depth look at classic monster collectibles. Ray is the world's foremost expert on topstone masks and is a beloved and respected figure in the classic horror community, having received the Monster Kid of the Year Rondo Award in 2006. Bearing an uncanny resemblance to Zé do Caixão, aka Coffin Joe, he portrayed the young version of the character in the 2008 feature film Embodiment of Evil and won Tabloid Witch Awards in the categories of Best Actor and Best Short Comedic Horror Film for The Blind Date of Coffin Joe. It's my pleasure to welcome my friend Raymond Castile to the show. Hi, Ray.
Hello, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh gosh, it's my pleasure. This has been a long time coming because I've really been wanting to get you onto the show. As we were talking about before, I love watching your YouTube channel where you discuss classic monster collectibles, and I think we first met in person. I think it was at the 2006 or 2007 Monster Bash. It was one of those early Monster Bash, or one of the early ones I went to.
It had to have been at least as far back as 2006.
Yeah.
That one before 2006?
I think that was the first one I went to, was 2006.
We knew each other online.
Yes, yep, through the Universal Monster Army and classic horror film board. And
when I first meet people, it's kind of a blur because I sort of meet them before I meet them, because I might know them for years online, and then I finally, hey, hi there. So I might, over the course of 20 years, I might know someone, but only a few hours of that would be face-to-face at a convention some weekend or whatever, and the rest is online. So maybe my priorities are changing between what does it mean to know somebody, to actually talk to them, or in face-to-face, hey, or to just communicate with them. I don't know.
Yeah, well, the internet has definitely changed whether, it does beg the question, do you know this person? But of course, we've met in person several times. I remember.
I know you're real.
Yeah. Or am I?
You have a physical form.
Today. I remember one was it Wonderfest? I think you were there as Coffin Joe, and you did a speech.
Yeah. There was a couple of years where I was going around, not as a guest, but just as a crazy fan, going around to conventions dressed as Coffin Joe and doing like a speech, and I'd gather people around. It would be an informal thing, like people. I had friends who would say, "Okay, Raymond's gonna do his Coffin Joe thing. Come over to this place at this time." And then people start. I'd wait, and people would gather and say, "Okay, now it's time." Then I'd have my outfit and everything, and I'm not going to do it now because I'm out of practice. but I do like 15-20 minutes of Coffin Joe.
Yes, in Portuguese too. You learned Portuguese.
Oh yeah. No, that was after I had been in the actual Coffin Joe movie. That was after that.
Yeah.
But before it was actually released. It was after I shot it, like 2006, 2007 into 2008, before it was released. So with that little 2-year period, I was sort of, I don't know, was I promoting the movie? Not, that wasn't my intent, but I guess that's sort of what was going on. I was kind of popularizing Coffin Joe to this
Oh, I remember online I was very excited for you that this was happening. For those who may not know, Coffin Joe was a legendary horror star in Brazil who made many films. Do you want to elaborate on Coffin Joe?
His real name is Jose Mujica Marins, and he was a director, actor, writer, producer. He was a Renaissance man. He did it all. He was an auteur, and he created in the 1960s. He was a Brazilian man in Brazil. In the 1960s, he created this character, Zedu Cachorro, Coffin Joe. In English, it's Coffin Joe, who is an undertaker. And if you want to know what he looks like, just look at your screen.
Yes.
Imagine a top hat.
Yep.
That's what he looks like. So
a cape and long fingernails.
Oh, yeah, my fingers are not long. One of the time I did, as part of my Coffin Joe fandom, I really did grow them out.
You did? Wow.
Yeah, but his fingernails originally were fake in the first couple of movies. Then he started growing it for real. But anyway, he's a undertaker, funeral director, and he's evil, but he's intellectual. He's philosophical. So he's not just like Michael Myers or Jason just killing people. He goes into these philosophical rants, gives speeches, and he talks to God even though he's an atheist. He's angry at God even though he doesn't believe he exists, and he has these arguments with God. And he wants to have a son because he believes that there's no heaven or hell or afterlife. We just die. We die and we're gone. So the only kind of continuation that of the human essence would be through children, through like your life essence continuing through your offspring and then living on forever as they have offspring. So the only way he can continue to exist is through a child. But also he hates humanity. He thinks people are stupid and superstitious. He hates religion. He hates small-mindedness, and he thinks that there's sounds in the background. He thinks that if he has a son, it'll be this perfect person, this Messiah, the Savior, who will save humanity and lead the world into an age of enlightenment. Now, he doesn't think he's perfect. Coffin Joe doesn't think he himself is perfect because he's the child of imperfect parents. But if he finds a perfect, near perfect woman, and they get together, their child will be pure and perfect and be this Messiah that will save the world. So, so he's on a mission to have this child. He always says a son. He doesn't consider the possibility he might have a daughter. Right. But he wants to have this son who's going to be a Messiah to save the world. And if he has to kill 100 people, anyone who gets in his way, he'll kill anybody to get this son. But most women don't want to marry or have children with a evil top hat, fingernail, torturing murderous guy. So he's always kidnapping women, and he's trying to find his perfect woman, and he does that by torturing them and murdering them. And
that doesn't sound like the right path.
But he always does eventually find someone who's like his counterpart. The movies, every movie, pretty much every movie, there's some woman who comes forward who is like, he is opposite, who wants to be with him, and then it always kind of goes wrong or something.
Yeah,
never gets the one he wants.
I loved. I remember you had, you did your cosplay as him, as Coffin Joe, and didn't somebody show the picture of you to him, and he thought it was himself?
Yes, I was a Coffin Joe fan, I guess, since the DVDs came out. I knew about him in the 90s because he had been to like children's theater, and I'd read about that. I thought maybe he was a horror host. In fact, he was a horror host in the 90s in Brazil. But I wasn't sure exactly what he was. I knew his name. I'd seen pictures of him. I knew he got a Lifetime Achievement Award at Schiller Theater in the early 90s. So I'd heard of him. But it wasn't until the DVDs came out that, and I saw that, kind of like your coffin box up there for Dark Shadows, there was a coffin box like that for Coffin Joe, and you could go to Walmart or Best Buy, or you could go to any store and you would see it on the shelf. It was widely distributed, and that was my first exposure to Coffin Joe. And then I got like the Something Weird VHS tapes. I caught up after the fact with those, and then there were DVDs in Brazil that weren't released in the United States, so I got those. And then I caught up with his filmography after first seeing the DVDs that were in that Coffin set.
Mhm.
This was early 2000s, and I just thought, where has this been all my life? It just, I mean, it sounds terrible to say you clicked with a character that's that evil and diabolical, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things, like a lot of evil characters. There's things that are universal in them that people can connect with. Otherwise, they wouldn't be popular.
Mhm.
Like even like someone like Norman Bates. I was talking to a friend of mine who's since passed away some years ago, thinking we were talking about Norman Bates in Psycho, and how he's actually depicted as a sympathetic character. And we both agreed that there were times when I think we said there were times when we felt like Norman Bates, because his, and I said, but so how is it that this character is so popular for so many decades? My friend said there are times when everybody feels like Norman Bates, even though they don't say so, they don't admit it. Even like, normal people, not just crazy people like us. Everyone at some point feels like Norman Bates. That's why it's a classic. If that were not the case, it would not have endured. So even the most evil or despicable or terrible character, like Darth Vader or whatever, they wouldn't be so popular if there wasn't something about them that you could identify with.
Sure.
And so Coffin Joe, he's a goth. That was a thing, but he's also he's an intelligent, thoughtful character. He's evil, but he's thoughtful. But he's kind of feels trapped in this little small town. Everybody hates him, and he's alienated.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that feeling of isolation and alienation that you can identify with, and a feeling of not being able to find your significant other, find your soulmate, whatever, in that searching, being kind of doomed never to find that person. But also, another thing I like about the character, he loves children.
Yes, I was going to comment on that.
He's this evil character, and I don't want even to go into all the things he does because it might get too dark for the show. He's a dark character.
Yeah.
Whatever you're thinking, if you haven't seen the movies, you don't know. He's a dark. This is in the 60s. This isn't like some recent torture porn kind of horrible thing. This is in the 1960s in black and white.
Yeah.
And there's stuff in those movies that you still.
Oh, we had to cut it. I hosted the Midnight I'll Take Your Soul in Portuguese. I hosted the whole episode in Portuguese, and there was a scene that we did have to kind of trim because we want the show to be like, we want kids to be able to watch it, and there was one scene in there I was like, oh, I don't think we can show that.
Yeah, even so, this is a black and white 1960s zero budget movie in Brazil that still has scenes so potent, so disturbing. It's still hard to watch.
Yeah.
I've been watching it with people in recent years, and there's parts where they're like, oh, that kind of freaks them out.
Sure.
But the thing I was going to say, he sincerely loves children, not in a perverse way, but in an honest way. He really loves. He thinks they're precious. He thinks they're, sacred and vital, and he would die to protect a child he loves. He's like a protector of children. And I like that. That juxtaposition is really super evil character, but he loves kids, and any child is safe.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And like you got to play him.
Who will protect you? He won't be under your bed trying to get you. He's actually going to protect you.
Right. So, and you got to play him in a film, which is really, as a fan, that must have just been amazing to get that opportunity to do that,
And as you were saying, I did like what they would now call a cosplay. I don't think they were calling it at that time, but I did a very nice costume, went through a lot of trouble to make it look movie accurate. It wasn't like some Spirit of Halloween thing. It was I went through it was a tailor made and everything. It was a lot of vintage parts in it and stuff. And I took some photos of a friend of mine named Max. I think you know Max Cheney.
Oh, sure, Max.
Yeah, the
drunken severed head. Yeah.
He took the pictures of me in this old cemetery with really old tombstones. And I put them online. This is pre-social media. I put them online, and the real Coffin Joe in Brazil, Jose Mujica Marins, but everyone just calls him Mujica. He's passed away now, unfortunately. Mujica did an interview, and I don't remember if it was for a magazine or what, but to illustrate the interview, the reporter, the publisher, used pictures of me because they just went online. So, oh, here's some great pictures. Let's use these. And so Mujica was reading the interview later, and he saw the pictures, and he said, "When did I do that photo shoot? I don't remember that." And then he started to realize, wait a minute, that's not me. And his wife at the time, I don't know if they were technically married, but they were, you know, his partner, let's say, his partner went online and said, "Oh, it's not you, it's this guy in Missouri in the United States." And so Mujica got in touch with me through someone who spoke English and just let me know he liked it, you know, and also there was no problem with it. I think on the website, I said, like, please don't sue me or something on the website. And he said, don't worry, he would never sue me. He loves it. Everything's great. So I was very happy to hear that. And I knew that they were making a new Coffin Joe movie. I'd read about it because I was keeping up with what was going on with Mujica and Coffin Joe. At that time, I was trying to at least have a working understanding of Portuguese. I was taking like these stuff on cassette tapes, those learn a language cassette tapes, and I was trying to learn the language at that time. And I was reading and using Translate online, reading Portuguese, Brazilian.
I remember you sent me some of your lines for the movie too. You emailed me with, like, I don't know, you asked me for some advice on some pronunciation thing or something like that at that time.
But I was reading Brazilian news sites and stuff, trying to just see what was going on with the world of Coffin Joe. So I was aware of this movie.
Yeah.
And then, I don't know, it was like 6 months after I got that first email, just kind of congratulating me on my costume and everything, that I got another email where the heading, the subject line was, "Do you want to be Coffin Joe?" And I read that. And as if they're doing this movie, there's a flashback that connects it with one of the 60s movies, because there's the 60s movie where the Coffin Joe dies in a swamp. He sinks into the swamp. And the government at the time, there was a dictatorship in Brazil, forced Mujica. Originally, he was going down cursing God and like an atheist to the end. They forced him to change it so he finds Jesus at the last minute before he sinks. And Mujica hated that. So he wanted to undo that. All his career, he's wanted to undo that ending somehow. So he wanted to connect this new movie to that movie to show him coming back up out of the water, unrepentant, and show how he kind of got from where he was sinking into the swamp at that end to where he is now. So he wanted a connecting scene, but there was no one he could find that looked like him or acted like him. No one that could replace him in that scene, because he wanted it to be seamless, as if this were a deleted scene from back then, so that you couldn't even tell that it was a reshot or a new thing. And he couldn't find anyone who could do that. So I said, I'll do that. So he contacted me and said, sure, I'll do it. And then so I went to Brazil for a week, and they put me in a nice hotel. It was very, very nice experience. And Mujica was great. It was a sad, when I got there, his co-star in the movie, who was a legendary actor in Brazil. I wasn't familiar with him, but I quickly, that night when I arrived, read all about him. He was like the Jack Nicholson of Brazil. That was what people were calling him. He was a co-star in this movie. He died. So it was a very sad atmosphere when I arrived on the set the first day.
Oh, yeah.
Even though I didn't have anything to shoot, they wanted me there just to meet Mujica and say hi and everything.
He
Well,
died during the filming or right before it?
not on the set,
Oh,
but during while production was going on. Yeah,
oh,
he died at a
that's
hospital.
sad. Yeah, yeah.
So I arrived and everyone was like,
Oh man,
what's
yeah.
going on? And well, the co-star just died. Oh, is the movie over now or what's yikes, that's terrible. So then
Yeah.
Majika arrives and he's always wearing his costume. And he kind of arrives, he's got like his people on either side, like patting on the back and holding him. He's like that. And he's got his hat and his cape and he's all sad. And he arrives and he's like, oh gosh. He just got back from the hospital where the actor died.
Oh
He
gosh.
sits down and he's talking to his people like, what are we gonna do? What are we gonna do? And he's like, and then they say, oh, Mashika, this is Raymond. He goes, oh, Raymond. He tried to like be nice and welcoming, even though it was very sad. And we talked through a translator for a while, and we really clicked like boom. I mean, we clicked big time. And like within a couple hours, he was literally crying on my shoulder. He was like,
Oh wow.
yeah, I was like,
Wow. Yeah.
he was like crying, and we were having a moment there.
Yeah.
So like it was like meeting your lifelong best friend that you just met, sort of.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
wild.
So
Wow.
that was quite an experience. Then he
Yeah.
called the whole crew over outside. This was all in the studio. They called outside the studio in this outdoor area, and everyone gathered around. And he'd made his decision. We're not going to shoot anymore today, but we are going to finish this. We're going to continue. I don't know how yet, but we're going to continue. But we can't do anything more today.
Yeah.
And he said something like, "I can't be Coffin Joe today," or something like that. And he dismissed everybody. So that was my first day there.
Yeah.
Dramatic.
Wow.
It's almost like a movie or a TV show or something. Just you're writing this to be very dramatic.
You'd have like a documentary about your, experience just being there. Yeah.
I mean, I could fill your whole 2 hours talking about it.
Yeah.
It was a dramatic week. We shot the movie. 2 years later, I went back for the premiere. You know, it always takes a long time when you shoot a movie and when you release a movie. So I spent another week there. I shot it to 2006, premiered in 2008, went back, and it was another great week. When I went back, it was much more upbeat, of course, at that point. And we did like TV interviews, and we had a red carpet premiere. It was a lot of press. It was a great experience. Both times it was a great experience. And unfortunately, Mojika passed away just before COVID hit.
Yeah.
He didn't die of COVID. He died right. It was like that. What was it? I don't remember. It was February or March, but it was right before the COVID exploded.
Yeah.
So he didn't see the whole world go into lockdown. It was just like a couple of weeks before that happened. He didn't see the end of the world, so to speak.
Right.
And I told a friend, the assistant director on the film, I said, it's as if Majika had been holding the world together, and when he died, the world just fell apart.
Oh.
That's what it felt like.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Well, thank you for sharing all of that, Ray. I'm sure you're going to delve into this more when you on future videos on your amazing YouTube channel as well. I know you've
avoiding talking about it on my Basement of Horror show just because it's, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'll get into it eventually, but I would sidestep it on the show.
Everyone, I'm sure everyone would love to hear about it. I want to talk about Basement of Horror, but I also want to, we're going to be talking about the 1995 storyline on Dark Shadows today. A 2-week storyline, very impactful. But before we get to that, I want to talk with you about your own history as a fan of classic horror, of Dark Shadows. Growing up, I listening to your YouTube videos and your show, a lot of what you say resonates with me because I consider myself a 70s monster kid. I grew up in the 70s, and into people ask, are you a 70s kid or an 80s kid? I'm kind of like right on that line. I was born in the early 70s. I remember the monster stuff in the 70s, and I loved that stuff. So when you talk about monster stuff, growing up and seeing all that stuff, it just like I light up because it just resonates with me a lot. So can you talk a little bit about your childhood, growing up liking all of this stuff?
Yeah, well, I would consider myself definitely a 70s kid. I mean, the 80s were I would say my teen years. That's when I went to
Mm,
high school and everything. That
same.
was my childhood, was the
Mhm.
70s. Um, and I don't remember a time when I wasn't a monster kid. And for people who don't know, monster kid, that David Colton was a former editor of USA Today, and he was sort of a grand poobah of online monster fandom in the 90s. And he's still a big figure in classic horror fandom. And he's the one who came up with this term monster kid. He wrote a poem called The Monster Kids. And this is in the 90s, back when that really wasn't a thing yet. I mean, I remember a time when it was just not cool to like monsters or horror. It was still like you were the geekiest of the geeks.
Mhm.
There was the nerds, and then there were the nerds among nerds. That was that was the horror monster people. So it wasn't like it is now. So it was kind of a big deal. Just a little thing like this poem, which today would be like a blip and no one would care. And back then, people cared. It made an impact. This poem, "The Monster Kids," where he talked about in the poem growing up, watching horror movies on TV and playing with the toys and all. Just beat the whole atmosphere of growing up, being a fan of monsters. But it was really referring to 60s monster kids. And there was sort of a bias against 70s monster kids at that time. And I think myself and some others were some of the monster fans that try to push against that and say, no, no, we're monster kids too, even though we're from the 70s. I think I've heard you say something about being a child of the glow. Have you used that?
I have used it. I think that I usually refer to the 70s monster craze as the aftershock.
Yeah.
And I know I think David may have coined
You'll
Children
know,
of the Glow.
actually, I think it was Bob Morris who's a collector who in a negative way called us children of the glow.
Oh,
He wrote,
really? Because of the Glow, Aurora Glow model
yeah,
kits.
like
Yeah.
here's one right here.
Yeah.
That's a 70s Aurora Glow kit. So but he was not being, I don't think he was being funny. I think he was really like, you're not really monster kids or something like that.
Mm.
But I embraced that and I started using that and calling myself child of the glow. And I think like uh Professor Griffin and some others adopted that, and we all started saying we're children of the glow.
But
So
yeah.
I grew up in the 70s, and there were monsters everywhere in the 70s. I know everyone's talked about 60s, 60s, 60s. I'm sure it was a blast in the 60s, but in the 70s, there were monster movies on TV. There were monster toys in the store. There were monster magazines. There were monster comic books. It just monsters everywhere in the popular culture.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It was a no. It's not really strange that kids grew up liking monsters. It was just like if you were in the 80s, maybe you grew up with Masters of the Universe or Real American Hero or Turtles. And if you were in the 90s, maybe it was Power Rangers or I don't know what else, McFarlane toys or something. I don't know what 90s stuff, but today I guess you like your phone, not
Yes, definitely. It's definitely the phone thing.
yeah. But back then it was monsters. It was Frankenstein, Dracula, and Creature from the Black Lagoon, etc., etc. And also there was Scooby Doo, and there was more,
Sure.
kitty type monster stuff. And I grew up in the St. Louis area, and we had a horror host that I thought was local, but it turns out he wasn't. It was Sinister Seymour.
Oh, sure. Yep.
He was my horror host growing up. He had a black wide brimmed hat and a black cape and a very gaunt kind of look. And I now know that he was shooting that in Los Angeles and it was syndicated, but back then I didn't know. I thought he was in St. Louis. So that was the only horror host I knew, but I had a horror host, a real honest to goodness horror host on TV. And over time there were some other, not as good as him, but there were some other horror hosts that were local that came along. But I could go to the store and I could buy or ask my parents to buy action figures of all the Universal monsters or rubber toys or Aurora model kits. And I would always have my dad build the model kits. I was too young for that. I build them, then I would try to play with them and break them. So he would spend hours building them, and I'd immediately try to play with them and destroy them.
You snap them off.
and we had and there was Famous Monsters magazine, so it was like an actual journal of what you were a fan of that kind of legitimized it. So it wasn't like you're just floating out into weirdness. There was this official publication that sort of put a stamp of approval on your mindset. And so I was all big into monsters, and then like every other kid, Star Wars hits, but I didn't flush monsters down the toilet. I sort of folded it all in, but certainly in the late 70s, my focus started to shift a little more towards Star Wars. But I never left the monsters completely. I was always the monster kid. And then there was Jaws, and there was Alien, and there was some other, and then the slashers came along. So there was still, even then with Star Wars, new monster stuff that was popular in the mainstream. So it wasn't until really high school that it really started to recede. And I didn't, well, I on the one hand, I was going to say then I didn't think much about monsters anymore. On the other hand, that's when I started watching Dark Shadows in syndication in high school.
In the 80s?
Yeah. So I don't know, is it, that might be an unintentional segue to how I.
No, that's a great segue. Yeah. How did it go? How did you just discover Dark Shadows in high school?
Well, as a kid, I had the Dark Shadows Barnabas game with the skeletons.
Yeah.
Not as a youth, but brand new.
Yeah.
My mom bought it. I don't remember asking for it. I think my mom bought it. She must have seen Dark Shadows, I assume, because she seemed to know what it was. And I had some of the Gold Key comics, and if I didn't own them, then I read them at the store. Yeah, I mean, I read a lot of comics as a kid, but I only actually owned so many of them because my parents wouldn't buy them. So for every one I owned, there was 10 more I read at the store.
I used to do that too. Yeah.
So I mean, I had a lot of exposure to the Gold Key Dark Shadows comic book. I only owned a few, but I read several over the years.
So you were aware of Dark Shadows prior to having watched it?
So for me, Dark Shadows was this comic book with Barnabas and everything, and this game, the comic book and the game. So it was part of my childhood. It's just not the show. And then there was the Dennis Gifford horror movies book, that big book, and Barnabas was in there. And there was another still from Dark. And then there were other like children's horror books like you get from the school library about horror movies and stuff. And there would always be a chapter would have a picture of Barnabas with his fangs and his cane. Well, I should have had the cane back. I've got one of those.
Please, like, I have.
There it is.
Yeah.
But so I knew who Barnabas was. I knew Dark Shadows. It was a part of my childhood without actually seeing the show. So it's, in a way, I almost feel like one of those like running home from school kids, because those things were current. The game was current. The comic book was current. That was all current stuff. And I was there and I experienced that, and that was part of my childhood, but the show wasn't part of my childhood. And I was alive during the last chunk of time the show was on. So who knows, maybe my mom pointed my eyes at the screen and I saw it, but I don't remember it. So I was alive during while Dark Shadows was on the air, and I had the current comic book and I had some of the current merchandising, but I never saw the show until the 80s when it was syndicated, and in my market it was on PBS station. So I was in high school. I was really into Doctor Who. I was into the Jeremy Brett Granada Sherlock Holmes series. And Dark Shadows just kind of fit into all that. It was compatible with all that. Stuff. And Barnabas, as a character, he felt compatible with Brett's Sherlock Holmes or some of the doctors, and he was that sort of character. He's just that aesthetic.
Yeah.
And so I got very into the show, obviously, but also particularly into Barnabas. And as I was talking about identifying with characters,
I was going to say, yeah.
I totally identified with Barnabas.
Well, yeah, and so many people did connect with Barnabas despite some of the horrible stuff he was doing. There was that glimmer of humanity that sort of grew through the series that you kind of connected with. Sure,
especially for a teenager. He's so much angst and lost love, unrequited love, and being an outsider and not it's very a lot. There's a lot of things for a teenager to connect with, and even the darker stuff. A lot of teenagers feel like they're causing harm or causing trouble or something that they don't want to. That's part of the sort of the awkwardness of being a teenager, and so there's a lot of levels where a teen, where anyone, but particular teen, would identify with Barnabas. So yeah, I absolutely identified with him. I did like it when he started to soften up later. Because I knew sort of the trajectory of the show, even though I hadn't watched it. I knew because I saw from the first Barnabas episode where he's got Willie by the neck. I seen that as soon as they started syndicating it locally from day one, I was watching it. So I knew kind of where it was going. I knew, okay, he's really kind of evil, not very nice right now, but I knew sort of from reading about it, where they were going to go eventually. So I kind of had some context there. But I definitely liked the more likable Barnabas from a couple of years in, more than the more Dracula-like menace, the more House of Dark Shadows type Barnabas in the early months. But even in the early months, there were still things to identify with. And then I kind of lost track of Dark Shadows a little bit, because they went through halfway through the parallel time story until he was stuck in his coffin, and then that was it.
That's where the syndication package ended. Yeah, yep.
Kind of left me hanging there.
Yeah.
So, and I didn't really reconnect. I didn't watch it on the Sci-Fi Channel because the scheduling never worked out. They were all showing at weird times, and I was never available. So it wasn't until the 2000s, really until streaming. I caught up with it again streaming, and then like Amazon, those kind of services over the last several years. I rewound a little bit into the Leviathan story, not to the very beginning, but I like halfway through, because the very beginning Barnabas is under their control, and it's kind of like, so I went to the point where he kind of regains control of himself through to the end of the series, and that was the first time I ever saw like the Bramwell, that parallel 1841 parallel time. I read all about it. I was very curious about it. I couldn't wrap my mind, like, how are they going to do this? Like, so all the characters are different, but and so I finally saw it, and I liked it. I certainly would have rather they stayed. Well, I would have rather the show had continued and they went back. I don't mind that little detour. It would have been nice if kind of like a Prime Universe character were in there.
I agreed. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, to give it something of an anchor. Yeah. But I didn't mind that little detour. It's too bad that it ended there.
I agree. I would have been nice to have like just maybe a month or even a couple of weeks where they just come back to the present day and just kind of have a final, even if it was a brief storyline to kind of wrap things up. But I wonder if leaving it like that made people hungry for more, and maybe that's also what plays into the desire for more Dark Shadows, like just the way it ended in this alternate time band with none of the characters.
How many, and I hate to use words like franchises and IPs, but
I know.
Yeah. I don't know what else to say. How many IPs, how many end in a nice, tidy way?
True.
I'm going all the way back into the 1800s. I mean, classic IPs from like going back 200 years. How many of them are all wrapped up nice and tidy? They all just kind of stop. Something stops them, like they stop making money, or someone dies, or someone gets fired, or something happens, and they just sort of stop. It's rare that something gets all wrapped up nicely. And then if it does get wrapped up nicely, someone comes along later and unwraps it and messes it up.
Yes.
I mean, we're not naming names. We were kind of talking about that
Yeah.
a couple hours ago.
That seems to be the case, and with a lot of these franchises, I guess, for lack of a better word, that does happen. One thing I want to bring up too is I've heard you talk about this on your show, and I've talked about this as well. The monster craze in the 60s is sort of the famous monster craze that happened in the 60s with the shock theater package, and you had, the Aurora model kits and famous monsters of filmland. But then
it's really a 50s thing, though. Everyone talks about it like the 60s.
What's that? Famous monsters?
The shock theater package.
Oh, he started in the 57. So, I mean, yeah, technically it was the late 50s, but it continued. But then I think when it started in the late 50s. Well, you had Vampire in 54, but that was pre-shock theater. But then shock theater was 57. And then but then in the early 60s, you saw this proliferation, even more horror hosts.
Shock theater.
What's that?
In the 60s and beyond, you didn't need this package anymore.
Yeah, no,
it took off on its own.
Son of Shock. Yeah, it kind of took off on its own, but you had all of this happening in the 60s with the 60s monster craze. And then it kind of, there was a dip, which you talk about a lot on your channel on the Basement of Horror with, the space, the moon landing and stuff. Kids kind of were focusing on this moon space stuff, but then there was another.
Whereas like when Star Wars came along a decade later, you had dip.
It was a dip again.
Space keeps kicking our rear ends. It just
I know, right?
We get this space stuff that
derails us and shifts over to this. But Dark Shadows was, kind of bridged those two monster crazes in a lot of ways, I think, because Dark Shadows started in the 60s and ended in the early 70s. And it's sort of, I think Dark Shadows often doesn't get enough when you read articles about, about monster culture and kids in the 60s and, building the Aurora model kits or whatever, things like that, famous monsters. I think Dark Shadows is an important part of that tapestry, particularly as we go from the 60s into the 70s. You have any thoughts on that?
I could just say no and get up and leave. That would not.
You disagree?
No, I agree. It certainly did exist during that time.
I guess Hammer too. I mean, you could say Hammer horror too, like that kind of sort of gothic horror element.
What I'm wondering is when you say bridge the gap, do you think that it
was there a gap?
Responsible for a resurgence in horror in the 70s? Because when I think of bridging it, I think of something that maybe without it would have died. Without it, you wouldn't have had the horror resurgence.
I don't know if it was maybe. I mean, we could point the finger to Dan Curtis and say Dan Curtis also played a role in keeping, in addition to Dark Shadows, with all of the other stuff he was doing in the 70s with the TV horror stuff like the Night Stalker.
Yeah, you can have a discussion of Dan Curtis TV horror that doesn't even cover Dark Shadows and still it would still be a very rich conversation with a lot to talk about.
Sure.
Dark Shadows. So
I would say, I don't think solely responsible, but I think it was a key element in sort of continuing, keeping the gothic horror ball rolling, I guess, from the 60s and into the 70s. And then you see another spike like I remember like the Marvel monsters in the 70s and the glow kits.
I wonder if Dark Shadows has an influence we don't really know about, because you just mentioned Marvel. I've heard people say that they think like Tomb of Dracula and Werewolf by Night, that they think that those might have been influenced by Dark Shadows. I'm not qualified to really say, but other people I think have seen an influence there. And
I could see that.
Independent horror, some people have seen an influence in some of the vampire and werewolf films.
For sure.
The movie House of Dark Shadows. So this bridge, here's this river of the moon landing in space and all this non-horror river, and then we've got the 60s horror land and the 70s horror land, but there's a river there. So if we have this bridge, this Dark Shadows, I feel like House of Dark Shadows, the movie, is like this catapult, flaming catapult that goes poof into the 70s and explodes and kills several hundred people. It's this House of Dark Shadows is this very 70s, very aggressive, full-blooded. It is a 70s sort of grindhouse exploitation in your face horror movie. That's sort of like almost like Dark Shadows from the 60s looking at the 70s, say, okay,
right.
take that.
Well, it is that more, yeah, it's, I mean, I think it was Dr. Durant on his YouTube channel. He was talking about the Pickwick horror record that scarred me for life, which I think was from the early 70s. I have it back there. You may be able to see it back there. You can't really see it. It's
on top of it.
Yeah, it's, I mean, he described it, and I think just 70s monster for the horror craze in the 70s as lurid, more lurid than the 60s monster craze. And I think House of Dark Shadows kind of falls into that category for sure.
A grenade thrown into the Dark Shadows, packing up everything, all the mojo it's got into this grenade and tossing it into the
right.
So, so I wonder if that movie, which was successful, if that had an influence. See, I don't have the. It was like, for instance, Count Yorga. Is that before or after House of Dark Shadows?
Count Yorga. What year did
Blackula?
I think it was after. Blackula was after. And in fact, I was talking to Dominique Lamzes about Blackula because I think Dark Shadows had an influence on Blackula. And Scream. I think they're Barnabas, the characterization of Barnabas in terms of the lost love and the kind of their elements of sympathy with regard to the vampire definitely is something you see a lot in vampire fiction after Dark Shadows. So in that sense, Dark Shadows, I think, in terms of like bridging 60s and 70s, I think Dark Shadows after that, post Dark Shadows, you start to see a lot more of that kind of a vampire with the lost love and the sympathetic characteristics and all of that kind of thing.
And I wonder how much Dark Shadows influenced its own creator, Dan Curtis, because there's a lot of Dark Shadows in the Night Stalker, movie, both and the Night Strangler too, but more so the first one. I mean, that vampire is almost like, Barnabas got up on the wrong side of bed or something.
Right. The wrong side of coffin, yeah. And then, of course, there's the Dracula with Jack Palance, too, which is very Dark Shadows-esque in certain ways. But yeah. What about okay, so you have this channel, the Basement of Horror. Like, can you talk a little bit about your interest in collecting monsters?
Well, let's see. It's hard to say, like, why do I collect? I don't know why I collect anything, but as a kid, I certainly was not a collector. I just had toys and stuff, and through the good graces of my parents and grandparents and their money and their willingness to buy, because my parents were always anti-monster with me. They kept trying to get me out of this whole monster thing over and over and over. And then my grandmother was always, as grandmothers often are, they're always trying to do the opposite of what the parents want. So if there's something the parents are trying to get the child out of, grandma's indulging that interest. So if there was a monster toy I wanted, my parents were like, no, we're not going to get that terrible thing. As soon as my grandmother knew that she would get that. But my parents bought me a lot of monster toys and games and stuff. And like I said, my mom bought that Dark Shadows game, and my grandmother bought me a lot of stuff. So I wasn't collecting this stuff. I was just a kid enjoying the fact that I had a family willing and able to buy me all this junk. And I was just playing with it and enjoying being a kid and watching the movies and reading the magazines and stuff. And then through my teenage years, as I said, I was kind of receding from horror, although at the same time getting into Dark Shadows, but I wasn't playing with toys. I wasn't collecting. I was watching the stuff, but I wasn't surrounding myself with totems and spending money on it. And it wasn't until I was in college. Well, so the collecting world sort of all blew up at the same time. I think it was the '89 Batman that really mainstreamed collecting, because that's when people who never really had considered buying toys or stuff started to do it. I think there's something about the phenomenon of that movie that was the lit the fuse that made all kinds of pop culture collecting suddenly become mainstream, whereas just a year before it wasn't. Mm-hmm. So it was around that time, into the late 80s and early 90s, that I started collecting toys. And I maybe I would have been collecting them all along if I knew there was such a thing. I didn't know that you could collect a toy. I didn't know that you could find old toys still in the package or in unplayed with condition. I didn't know that anybody cared about that stuff. I didn't know that. I thought a 20-year-old toy still in the package should be worth $3 because it's old. Isn't that what happens when something gets old? It gets worth less and less and less, right? That's what happens at the store. They clearance it. Clearance it. So I had this whole idea that it would become worth more money or become more desirable, or people would invest it psychologically with more value. That was like it was a new way to think. But when I discovered that there was this thing called collecting, and you could find this stuff, it's hard to say why it fascinated me, but it just, I think it was sort of like, almost like whatever spirit I had back in the childhood playing with the toys, there was a way I could, that was still inside of me. And no, as an adult, I'm not going to play with toys, but I could still take that same spirit and continue it as an adult, instead of trying to box it up like a vampire in a coffin, trying to keep it contained. I could open the coffin and let it out. And there was a socially acceptable way to do that. Mm-hmm. But I also think there's a bit of a mental illness. When you start collecting, I mean, I'm looking at your stuff back there.
It is. I have a sickness. It's,
I mean, if I
you can relate.
I could, if I wanted to, have shelves and all that. Mm-hmm. For a variety of reasons, I don't. But I mean, I've got boxes and boxes of stuff packed away. I don't display stuff. I display it for purposes of a YouTube show. But in real life, I don't display it. But I have all that stuff. So it's kind of it is like a mental illness. I don't know if it's like a hoarding or almost a kind of OCD kind of a thing, where I don't know what it's, this desire to just have all this stuff.
Well, you're almost like you're like a curator in a museum, almost, is what it feels like to me. Like because you have it all very perfectly preserved, and but you show it, like, it's great that you share it in the way that you do and show people these really rare things. Like, my friend Meredith is also into collecting monsters, and you've been a huge influence on me in both good and bad ways. Financially bad, but good in that, like, oh wow, that's really cool.
I'm very impressed with this collection behind you. I know some of it,
yeah, some I already had, but a lot I didn't. I mean, I think, I don't know, over the last year or so, my collection has just exploded. But you definitely have this great way about you, where it's comforting and it's fun, and you talk about things in a fun way. So you show off these very rare items, and talk about them. And most people will see. So I was saying, my friend Meredith, and she'll show me a picture of something or whatever, and I was like, oh, Ray has that. She's like, of course Ray has that.
I have insecurities. I think I always feel like my collection is really not that great.
Really? Wow. You have an amazing collection. I don't know why you would think that, but
I don't know. It's okay. It's not, because particularly in recent years with social media, there are people who just have these insane collections that they have like an entire house,
wow,
filled with stuff, and they've just got, it must be worth millions, just these crazy collections. And I feel like we've got these sort of mega collections that have, where maybe they were all there and we just didn't know about it. Maybe they've emerged in recent years. There were always super collectors, but there was like a handful of them. But now it seems like there's a new category of collecting, of these mega collections that are just several lifetimes worth of collectibles. And something that maybe would be a once in a lifetime piece for you, they've got 50 of them.
Wow.
Not the same one, but like stuff of that caliber. And that's just in this corner of the room. And so over here is just mind-boggling. So I feel like I'm not like that. I feel like the standard, what's a great collection, would be like that. And I don't want that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's changed. I just don't care so much anymore.
Right.
I've got what I've got. I'm sure I'll buy more stuff over time, but I'm not like, when people ask me like what's something what are you after? What would you really like? What's an item that's like on your top of your want list or whatever? I'm like, I don't know. I don't really have one. I mean, I want my cat to be healthy.
Yeah. They're just things. Yeah, they're just material things. So they're not, it's just fun in a sort of a fun, nostalgic way. I think for me, that just reminds me of things that I like, that make me happy, and just seeing them makes me smile or makes me go, hey.
It makes me smile to see your collection.
Well, thank you. Well, you're definitely an inspiration.
I don't have a Dark Shadows collection.
That needs to change at some point, because you see that's now good. There needs to be a wing in the basement of
horror collection. I don't have a Dark Shadows collection. I have Universal monsters and all kinds of other stuff, but I don't have like what I'm looking at right there.
Yeah. I've been collecting Dark Shadows stuff since I was a kid, for a long time. And then I went through a long period where I stopped buying more Dark Shadows stuff. So I did go through a period where I sold some of it and kept some key pieces, but I've gone back and collected a lot of the things that I was missing. But they're new Dark Shadows collectibles now. I want to talk to you about this a little bit. And kind of announce this as well. There is a new Barnabas Collins, a bobblehead that just came out from MPI Home Video. There it is. You can kind of see it there. I have the old one too, so I'm going to just compare them here, and we can give our initial thoughts here. There isn't much Dark Shadows merchandise these days. Every so often, Hermes Press is doing the books and things like that. But as far as things like this, MPI every once in a while will put something out. The lunchbox was a home run when they did that with the beautiful
one that's in your right hand. I don't know. So as people are watching this, I guess it's on the left side of their screen. That looks like Jonathan Frid. Not
this
that one.
This one. Yes. This is the original one. Yep.
That looks like John. That captures his character, his essence, his expression, just his attitude. That looks like Jonathan Frid, and that looks like the costume is nice. That other one, I'm not sure who that is.
I don't know what happened. The hair, I like the bangs on.
Hair's nice,
but the bangs were, but I don't know what happened. For the audio listeners, I'm holding up the two Barnabas bobbleheads. There is a new Barnabas bobblehead from MPI. So the base is much smaller on the new one. They changed the lettering. It looks like kind of here. Yeah.
The new one has just the sans serif blah kind of Arial or something. And the old one, at least, is trying to have a bit of a Gothic look with the lettering.
Yeah. They have the two leaves on the bottom on the grass there, and he's holding the cane. The body looks pretty much the same. It just looks like
I will say this: the head of the cane on the new one is better.
Yeah, no. You're right. I think you're right. Yeah, the whole thing is actually, I think, is a new sculpt. Yes, you're right. Yep, the cane is different, and the collar on the back of the cape on the old one is better. There's like a little lip to it, whereas this one doesn't really have that. So I bought it, but I don't know why I did, because I have the old one, but I want to support Dark Shadows products. I bought it, but at the same time, I'm like looking at it, I'm like, this, I don't know what they were going for here.
Like a game show host, like a themed episode where he comes out just as a vampire.
Yeah. Yes. It's like if I don't. Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it. I don't know how else you could describe it.
Black clothing. That's kind of like Frankenstein green jacket.
Yes. The pet peeve. I also hate the green jacket on Frankenstein, but as people know too, I hate the brown coat on Barnabas. As I know you're not a fan of that as well, and I have that here too. This is the Majestic Studios Count Chocula version of Barnabas. here. I mean,
Did he
come
ever
on.
look like that?
I don't. He did have a brown suit that he wore in a few episodes during the Adam storyline, but that was short lived. And the coat, the Inverness coat, was never brown. He even has brown shoes on this figure. It's like they're all about the brown Barnabas here. I don't know why, but that's a very strange choice. And I asked Dr. Migo, because we're talking about Dark Shadows Migo figures, and
Dr. Migo is
Paul Clark.
He was very big in the customizing world, and he had this company called MC, which is sort of like his attempt to recreate Migo. And then now he's with the official Migo and involved with their official Migo action figures that you can find at Walmart or Target or wherever.
Yeah. And he said it was something with because he was involved with the MC was connected with Spectre Toys, which did these, where Barnabas is also wearing brown. For some strange reason, Barnabas is in brown here too. And he said it was the licensor wanted Barnabas in brown, which is strange because the licensor is doing all the MPI stuff, and Barnabas is wearing black in all of those. So I don't.
Even the older stuff, he's in black. I don't.
Yeah.
From those figures, I don't remember a time where all the licensed stuff had Barnabas in brown.
Isn't that weird? I don't understand why that happened. The only thing I could think of is maybe brown cloth was cheaper. I really don't understand why that choice was made. But
so Jim Pearson's the guy who makes these decisions. Have you
Yes.
know him, or you've talked to him? Or?
I don't know him personally. I have reached out to him. I hope to have him on at some point.
So if he's on, will you ask him about that?
I will. Yes, I will indeed ask him about that. Because I am curious about that myself. Because, like I said, all the vintage stuff and all the MPI stuff too is he's wearing black. So I don't get the brown stuff because I know.
Curious to hear what Mr. Pearson says.
Yeah, because I know Paul Clark was saying they'd like to do a Barnabas Migo. I don't know if they will, but he said they would like to do that. So if they do, I hope he is not wearing brown. I noticed Frankenstein lately, he's in black again, so that's exciting.
Yeah, that's good.
Lately, I've seen like the NECA one is in black, although the Jada Frankenstein is in green.
Green still pops up now and then. I think that I think there's different kinds of licenses, and you can get the generic sort of style guide license, which might still be in green, or you could get the Karloff movie likeness license, which maybe that's got the black.
Yeah. Do you think there's a Dark Shadows style guide? I want to ask Jim about that.
Mr. Pearson.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to ask
if there ever was, it should be on one of these shelves.
Yeah.
You should have it.
I would love to have a copy of that.
Because I know with Universal, they used to have printed style guides, and they were like booklets, and you could page through them and see the different illustrations of the monsters and what colors they should be and all that. That sounds a little advanced for because Dark Shadows, how much merchandising is there per year? So I don't know if they would do the expense of printing a book like that.
True.
Or how many pieces might they license in a year? I don't know.
And I maybe it's better that if there isn't one, just because I like what you say on your channel about how things are licensed now within an inch of their lives, and everything has to check all the boxes in the style guide.
Style guided within an inch of their lives.
Style guided, within an inch of
style guided to a verb.
Yeah. It's because that leaves very little room for creative expression when you have to be so by the books with every single thing, and it's nice. That's why I like the vintage stuff.
This is my childhood creature.
Yes. Yeah.
That is the one that I actually played with as a kid.
So
I've had that and I've got a photo of me the day I got this. I hesitate because I had two of them as a kid. One broke, and then I got a replacement. This is the replacement. So I don't know in the photo. There's a photo of me as a kid sitting in my grandmother's lap, opening the card for this creature. I don't know if it's the one that broke or if it's this one, but it's nice that I have that photo. But anyway, the reason this is my childhood buddy. He's been with me my whole life. And imagine not as a tribute piece or as a retro piece, but as a brand new piece. No one would make a Creature from the Black Lagoon action figure that looked like that.
Yeah.
Today. It's very crude and stylized, but it's cool. And they just it looks like the Creature from the Black Lagoon. But today it would look very sterile.
Yeah. Yep. And for the audio listeners, this is the Azraq Hamway International Creature from the Black Lagoon. If you haven't seen it, do a Google image search for it. You'll see what it looks like. It's such a classic toy.
It's very cute. It's very crude. It's very cool. And it captures, here's the thing. You can capture the likeness of something, or you can capture the spirit of something. And those old toys and model kits and all other kinds of products, they captured the spirit of those monster characters. They captured what they look like in our imaginations, not necessarily what they look like on the screen. And what would you, as a kid playing with something, what would you rather have? I think you want something that captures the way you feel about it.
Sure.
And now it's all this kind of wax museum sort of replica of either it's that kind of a replica of what you see on the screen, or it's the opposite extreme, these goofy style guide cartoon things that look nothing. They don't look cool, they don't look neat, they don't look fun, and they also don't look like the movie image or the actor either. So I don't know who they're for.
Yeah. Yep.
I'm gonna take a cue from you and drink something.
I agree.
I don't know what the expiration date is on this bottle I'm opening. It could be 2 years expired.
Perhaps it's been infected by the supernatural forces that inhabit the basement of horror.
You don't know Johnny Shedrick, do you?
I don't know.
MIB Master Toy Room, 1979.
Oh yes, I know him. Yes, of course, sure.
Everyone kids him about the ghost in his basement.
He's great. I like how
that's the first thing that comes to my head.
MIB Toy Museum. I'll be your curator today. I love how he always starts the videos. Yeah, he's great.
Hello, collectors.
Yes. We should talk about 1995, which is
short.
It is
25 minutes. We'll have time left over.
It is,
the other 30 minutes.
True. Well, I'm sure we'll have a lot to say about it because it's a short storyline, but it's a very memorable storyline. And this is one of those, as you pointed out, Dark Shadows in syndication ended in the middle of parallel time. So people who were watching Dark Shadows, I guess second generation fans, or people who missed it the first time around, didn't get to see 1995. I remember reading about it prior to having watched it and was shocked even just reading about it. But then watching it, it's such, I know people sometimes will knock the last year of Dark Shadows in terms of its storylines and stuff, that not as strong as some of the earlier storylines. I don't necessarily agree with that, especially because I think this storyline there's something so apocalyptic about 1995 when Barnabas and Julia come out of 1970 parallel time. They enter the room, and somehow they've been thrust forward in time, back into their own time band, but forward in time. There's all kinds of strange time travel stuff happening in Collinwood. My theory has always been, there's they've messed with time so much in Collinwood with the time travel that the barriers.
I think like from like halfway through the series forward, Dark Shadows it's as much a science fiction time travel show as it is a gothic horror show.
Interestingly,
becomes such a big part of the story. Even when they're not traveling in time, it feels like there's still this element to it. It really turns into a like Doctor Who or something, a sci-fi fantasy film or sci-fi fantasy story, but with a dark gothic atmosphere.
Yeah. A lot of times the time travel in Dark Shadows is accomplished through the use of the occult, the I Ching, for example, or the seance with Vicky getting thrust back in time. They never really explain why parallel time came into existence. It's just there in a room in the East Wing.
And this is actually some of the things I noted, that when Barnabas and Julia arrive in 1995, they make a point in the dialogue of almost establishing a kind of pulp sci-fi groundwork to what's going to happen, because Barnabas talks about time warps and radioactivity and uses sci-fi lingo.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, like, why did they do that? It's almost like they're trying to position the story as something more science fiction oriented, but then they don't stick with that. By the time it's done, it's back to ghosts and gothic and crosses and stuff. But it feels like in the beginning, one thing I wonder with 95, did this start as a longer story and it get condensed? Because it feels like they lay the groundwork for things and plant some seeds that never sprout, that they never they drop some things. It feels like they're trying to set the stage for certain things, but then it doesn't pan out. Well, can we back up a little, because they're coming off of this parallel time. And now you were talking about how people think the last year of Dark Shadows is weak.
Not everyone, but some people.
Yeah, rewatching like over recent years, I found that, I mean, this is maybe a controversial thing to say. I think 1970 parallel time might be my favorite storyline.
It's a great storyline.
Yeah, with the, even though Barnabas is out of the story, I don't like that. I wish it's okay for him like a week or two, but he's out too long. On the other hand, that gives the other characters a chance to breathe and the other stories a chance to develop, so that when he is dropped back into it, it's almost more dramatic. There's more impact, because it kind of shakes things up more, because there's this established world. It's almost turned into a different show now. And then Barnabas descends into the middle of that.
People are waiting for that. It's like, when is this going to happen? Because I remember watching that, like, when is Barnabas going to come back? Like, when is he going to come back into the picture? And you're waiting for it and waiting for it.
He doesn't disappoint. He's really, some of my favorite moments. Like, I love when Angelique, when he's looking at her painting and he says something like, "I want to see through the eyes of Angelique," and he has like that special effect with,
right.
Like, what's going on? And like Julia's, the evil other Julia's with her, and she's like, "What's going on?" And she rushes into the room and she's like, like, "What are you? Who are you?" And he's like, kind of turned around with the painting, like, "Yes, I know what you are." And
yes, I love that. I love it when Barnabas does things like that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when he uses his powers in that way. They're in in parallel time. The Collinwood is burned to the ground by the evil version of Stokes in parallel time, and he's separated from Roxanne. And then time band shifts. Barnabas and Julia are now in this. They don't know it yet, but they're in the future now. And of course, Barnabas is like, "I will always hate this room for what it has done to me." Of course.
Is there a room Barnabas enters that doesn't make him feel that way?
Yeah. And he says,
drama and tragedy.
He says that Roxanne was the first woman to make him forget his beloved Josette, which I always had a kind of a hard time buying that, just because he was obsessed with Josette for so long, and now Roxanne has kind of come along and he's shifted his.
I do like Roxanne. I mean, I don't know.
I like Roxanne. No, she's cool. But
I badmouth Roxanne, but I like Roxanne. Yeah. I can see what Barnabas sees in her.
They're in the future. Julia, and of course, there's some. I really like that Barnabas and Julia are kind of. I mean, they develop into this team, almost like a Holmes and Watson kind of a situation, I guess. They're with the two of them, but Julia, of course, there's some great scenes here where Julia clearly is. I think you recall Julia was just the ultimate example of someone being friend zoned, which
anyone who says friend zone doesn't exist, watch Dark Shadows. There it is.
Yeah.
Yes, it exists. That's what it is.
Yeah, she said,
and it's not. And I hate it when people. First of all, yes, you can be in a friend zone. It does exist. I hate it when people try to make the argument that saying you're in a friend zone. They always talk about sex. It means like the difference between being in a friend zone, not being in a friend zone, is whether you're having sex. It's nothing to do with sex. It's love. It's not sex. There's different kinds. There's family love, friendship love, and then there's romantic love. And it's a situation where one person is in love with someone who maybe loves them or really likes them as a friend. And so and the other person's maybe aware, maybe not, maybe doesn't want to be aware, or is kind of deliberately not wanting to see it. There's things that need to be said that are not being said. And it's to be like an unhealthy situation because neither one wants to completely end it and break up. So it's better to have this kind of painful relationship, at least it's a relationship, instead of risking destroying it. And in Barnabas and Julia's case, I think, well, there are times she tries to tell him how she feels. And there's one time she asked him to bite her. And he's like, no, don't say that. How could you say that? I wouldn't do that. And so there's times over the series where she says things. There's a time where Willie is trying to convince Barnabas, like, Barnabas, open your eyes. Don't you see, like, your soulmate is right there. Can't what? And Barnabas is like, what are you trying to get me to say, Willie? It's like,
yeah.
So there's it deals with it like every few months. There seems like there's a little moment like that, but it really, I think it comes to a head in the storyline, and you could almost look at the whole story as the story of this relationship from the opening moments and the closing moments. You could almost get rid of what's in between and just take those opening and closing moments as bookends that kind of define the relationship and also kind of give it a sort of a closure. I mean, that kind of relationship continues, but I feel like we get somewhere by the end of that story arc. We've not made peace with it, but we've gotten some kind of resolution to this tension.
Yeah.
Where they stand with one another.
Sure.
Not what we'd like, maybe, but there is an arc in the relationship over these 2 weeks where we end up with the opening moments, opening scenes. You have Barnabas moaning about Roxanne.
Yeah.
and Julia says something like, I know what it's like to be in this hopeless situation where you
something we learn to live
love
with
someone, they can never love you back or something like that. She's and of course we know what she's talking about, but Barnabas is sort of like, it's like going, right. But it's clear that he cares very deeply for Julia. I just don't think he doesn't think of her. He thinks of her as a friend that he cares for deeply, but he's not romantically interested in her. And he's also a vampire too at this point, which is, I think that has also, to, well, even when he's a human, he doesn't suddenly say,
no,
oh, he's been right here all along. It doesn't. So it's not just being a vampire, though that probably is part of that. He has a predatory quality as a vampire, which is another thing in this 1995 storyline. He has a predatory quality that he can't really help, that maybe is part of why he is only attracted to these beautiful young women. That could be it. That's, vampires go out for beautiful young women. It's kind of the tradition, but even when he's a human, he doesn't seem to see what's right in front of him.
Right.
With Julia. So, but there's obviously, I wouldn't say that they're incompatible. They're such good friends. I mean, he's a very dangerous creature, and she's someone who could potentially destroy him. So if ever there were two people who should be like this, it's them, and yet they're like this.
Sure.
So
and she does almost destroy him in this storyline, by under Gerard's control here, but it is and then he won't leave. He says never without you at the end. He won't leave without her. I took that as a gesture of his love for Julia, his caring for Julia, but some people will interpret that as a romantic.
I think it's a romantic moment. It can be a romantic.
Sure.
I see that moment and I go, it's a romantic moment, even if he doesn't mean it that way. I think at the beginning she's wondering if he cares at all, or what does she feel? What does he feel about me? Like, I'm kind of on the outside of this. And by the end, I mean, she, especially considering that he's a vampire, and if you make him mad, he's liable to just
Sure.
You, she's betrayed him. She's almost caused his destruction. She's done a lot of damage. So, and it would be in his survival wise, his best interest to just do what she says, get out of there.
But he would certainly
sacrificing in that moment. And of course, that line, "Never without you," that's, I think, one of the great lines of the series.
Oh, it's a classic line. Oh, for sure. Yeah, it is one of the great lines of the series. And
he's not going to leave her.
No, definitely not. And it just, I think you, like you said, it gives closure. It cements what that relationship is and going forward in the series. So they descend the stairs. They see that Collinwood is in utter ruins, which is, again, talk about a classic and memorable moment in the show. Seeing Collinwood just devastated, and what happened, how did this happen? It's so shocking. The Collinwood you've been with for all these years is a wreck. And I have a quote here from set designer Cy Tomashoff. If you don't mind, I'm going to just quickly read this. Set designer Cy Tomashoff, in the Dark Shadows Almanac, which was one of the books from Pomegranate Press, he said, "We decided that under these conditions, the windows would have been demolished. The ceiling and beams would have tumbled down, and plaster would have fallen off the walls and the ceilings. Leaves, dirt, and debris would have created havoc on the inside. I decided that the best way to achieve this was to layer on top of everything the added elements that would have registered their effects on the interior of the foyer and the drawing room. I designed what looked like the overhead beams and chunks of old plaster and had the crew suspend them from the grill above. We created torn and shredded draperies and broken windows in place of the existing ones. We took the doors off their hinges and stood them askew. We exposed the brick that was beneath the plaster, even though there had never been brick there before. The carpentry and paint shops had a couple of weeks to fabricate the various elements and ship them to the studio. I remember that it was a Friday night when the studio crew set everything in place in the drawing room and foyer. By midnight, we had placed all the rubble and all but 2 of the 8 hanging overhead sections of plaster and beams. The crew, who were by that time exhausted from a long and harrowing week of hard work, announced that whether I was done or not, they were going home. I really couldn't blame them, and I was only too happy myself to call it a night. The episodes that followed certainly gave the show yet another look, which was what kept us percolating. So Cy Tomashoff was amazing, and what they did to the set was amazing. And then they had to put it back together again for when they got back from 1995. Any thoughts on how Collinwood itself?
That set is so impressive. I mean, we kind of take the sets for granted on Dark Shadow. They're all impressive, but I feel like that needs some kind of special award for you wouldn't buy that storyline at all without those sets. That one thing, when I read about 1995 over the years, I wasn't sure, like, what are there like Jetsons, like sci-fi? Is everyone walking around in white jumpsuits or silver jumpsuits, or how do they depict 1995? Knowing the budget and the schedule and everything that the show is working with, I kept saying, how would they depict 1995? So when I finally saw it, it was interesting that for the most part, 1995 looked just like 1970.
Yeah,
they really didn't do anything to try to set it in the future. The one thing they did was that ruined Collinwood. That's the thing that separates it from the time period that we've been following up to that point. That's the thing that really smacks you in the face and makes you believe we're in the future. If they had just kind of put some cobwebs and knocked a few things askew, whatever, you wouldn't buy it. They created a different world inside. And it's so surprising to think that they did it so quickly, or that they did it at all, given the budget and everything they were dealing with. It's surprising. It's so immersive and so believable. It's almost more believable than the regular set.
Yeah,
it's this whole environment that they're walking through, and all these layers and everything. It might be the most impressive set on the show. Like I said, I mean, all the sets are impressive, but you kind of take them for granted, and they're what they are. They got the walls and the windows and the chairs. Most of the sets aren't really outlandish. That one, though, I mean, that could be a movie set. It's just if it were on film instead of video, that could be used in a movie. It's very multi-layered, feels very real, feels like you're in another world.
Yeah.
Which you are. You're in the future. You're in 1995. So it really makes you believe, it takes you out of the world that you've been in and up to that point. And they had to go all out with that to make it work. If they had slacked off a little and not gone so far with it, you wouldn't buy the story. So I'm very impressed with the production design of the ruined Collinwood. They went way beyond what you would have expected, and I'm still surprised when I was rewatching it, preparing for this program. I was really surprised, like, wow, they hit a home run. They really how much work did this take to create this? And I was looking at, like, how do they make this? I was trying to see the original set behind it, and it was hard. It's not like they just took the original set and put some stuff in front of it. Maybe they sort of what they did, but it doesn't look like that. It looks like the set is really demolished and time has passed and it's deteriorated. And there's so much detail everywhere. It's not just a couple of beams or something. You can look in the nooks and crannies and see they really put a lot of thought and work into creating this ruined future Collinwood. I am of two minds about the rest of the sets in that story. I do wish they had done something to make you also feel that a little bit when you go into like the police station or anywhere else. There's something, and I don't know, something with the fashions, something with the technology, just something, or just like a reference, like in the dialogue. Maybe instead of the United States, maybe it's like the Commonwealth of America, or maybe instead of a president, we have a prime minister or something, or mention some kind of instead of going to get some gas, going to get some, I don't know, some futuristic, something in the dialogue that says, oh, we're in the future. It's not the same world. That wouldn't have cost anything. It would have just been dialogue.
Right.
But there's nothing. There's nothing that says we're in the future except that ruined Collinwood. But on the other hand, if they had done that, it would have been very dated. No matter what they would have done, even movies with multi-million-dollar budgets look dated.
Right. And I wonder if that was why they went with, not going too far with or at all. But I know what you mean. Like,
thinking about people watching it years later, though.
True. Yeah. They would always say, oh, nobody's going to see this again. So maybe not,
It's good that in a way that they didn't do that, because no matter what they would have done, realistically, with their budget, it would have looked silly to now. It would, if they had tried to make the clothes or sets different, futuristic, it would have been distracting.
Another thing that indicates, that we're in the future and that some terrible catastrophe has taken place is when we start meeting the characters we know from the regular time band, and they're just shells of their former selves. They were either insane or just terrified of being anywhere near Collinwood or even mentioning Collinwood. So I'll read a little bit here of this, just as the storyline goes on. Barnabas and Julia find they've not returned to their own timeline, but to the future of 1995, where Collinwood is in ruins. They encounter Mrs. Johnson, the Collinwood housekeeper, now an old woman, and discover that David Collins died in 1970. They find an aged Carolyn living in a small house on the property. Carolyn is half insane and refusing to answer any of their questions about what happened to Collinwood. Julia goes to the records office in town, and the man suspiciously claims that all records about the Collins family have been destroyed. Whilst inside the remains of Collinwood, Julia is almost killed by a falling statue, and a strange, ghostly man can be seen staring out from one of the windows. They later find out from Mrs. Johnson that something happened in the playroom at Collinwood. So I'll stop reading there. This comes from the wiki page for the Dark Shadows storyline. So they leave out a lot of details there, but let's talk a little bit about some of this though. They go to the cemetery. They find out that they were in 1995 by looking at the gravestones, recent burials in 1995. They find David's grave. It says he died in 1970, and they see Mrs. Johnson putting the flowers on David's grave. And Clarice Blackburn, I love Clarice Blackburn. I feel like she doesn't get enough credit as an actress on Dark Shadows, and in this story, this is kind of her final, I think, little tour de force that she has here, because she gets to talk a little bit about, she doesn't really reveal what happened, but she drops all these hints that it was something to the effect, it was there was a spirit of joy in Collinwood that had not been there for a very long time, and it was a peaceful time, and then things started to happen. Something sinister happened.
The time that Barnabas and Julia were gone in parallel time.
Yeah, it was while Barnabas and Julia were gone. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
As soon as they get back, it's not very peaceful.
No. No.
We finally get a peaceful time. We don't get to see it.
Yeah.
Just hear about it.
We just hear about it. Yeah. And we meet Carolyn, who's, it's heartbreaking, I think, to see Carolyn completely out of her mind. You know, Carolyn's insane. She calls herself Fredericks. She lives in a shack. She has all these sort of artifacts from Collinwood.
That catch why she's Fredericks.
I don't know why the name Fredericks was used. It was just she didn't want to be. I mean, the name Collins, although she stuttered, Carolyn stuttered. I don't know why she didn't go by her married name Hawks, but she was she was using
something. Like, was there ever a Fredericks on the show? Like a
no, not that I can recall. No, I think she was just trying to distance herself from being associated with Collinwood at all.
So I think Nancy Barrett. So she's not my favorite actor on the show, but I think objectively she's the best actor on the show in terms of at least what we see. I think her performances and her range. I think she's the one who consistently gives the best performances. It's not the most flamboyant or fun role, so she's not my favorite. I mean, Jonathan Frid's my favorite actor on the show. And I like Laura Parker a lot too. And I like Grayson Hall. I mean, I like a lot of people, but so Nancy's not she's not up on the list of my favorites, but in trying to step back and objectively look at the performances, she's probably the best actor on the show. So she's always giving these great performances that are kind of unsung because they're not the most fun character, the most flamboyant, or they're not the
unless it's Pansy.
Yeah. I mean, you know, she's not Barnabas, she's not Angelique, she's not Professor Stokes.
Right, gotcha. Yeah.
So she doesn't quite get the credit she deserves, but she is. I only know her work on the show. She's a great actress on the show and is always delivering these wonderful, varied, nuanced performances. So her performance is really good at in terms of trying to pick this crazy, sad character, and the makeup is pretty decent. There's a close-up at one point late. I think this might be her last episode. There's a real extreme close-up of her face, and I took note of how the makeup was just kind of drawn on. It's really well done that still you buy it even when it's like that, and it's just like, you know, drawn on makeup. You don't. It doesn't look like a Halloween makeup. It still looks believable even that close up, and it's a very simple makeup. Whereas Professor Stokes, he's got kind of caked on. I don't know what they use. It's latex on his face. He's more overt, more exaggerated, and he's not the professors. I mean, both of them, Stokes and Carolyn, are shadows of their former selves. Carolyn's gone mad, and it's a very sad kind of performance. And Professor Stokes, he's not the brave Professor Stokes we know, who would try to be the problem solver and jump into the middle of this and try to figure everything out and kind of laugh in the face of evil. He's a broken man, and that's another way, as you were saying, it kind of gets across the idea that time has passed, that these characters they've been kind of downgraded from what we saw in the past, what we're used to. They're damaged from the characters that we knew. Quentin, he's gone insane.
He's also insane. Yeah,
he's very insane. So I like David Selby a lot. He's a great actor on the show. I had some issues with his performance in some parts. I feel like
he was almost childlike, I thought.
Yeah, but there's just, I don't know, some moments maybe he didn't quite know where to go with it, or maybe the direction wasn't quite right or something. But there were some moments with him that kind of took me out of the reality of the scene. I don't know. It it doesn't ruin it, but I wasn't as impressed with his handling of being insane, even though he had other storylines in Dark Shadows. He had been not in his right mind or something and did it much better. In this one, maybe it was he was trying to be childlike, or his reactions to things, he was trying to mimic a child. I'm not sure what he was doing, but there were some moments that didn't quite feel right. But he's usually the guy who's always kind of standing up straight and got the brandy or something, and he's in charge. He's kind of unflappable. So to see him kind of,
right, yeah,
that was sad to see. It was sad to see. The whole story is a sad story.
Sad, yes.
All these grand characters are.
I think that's what I kept writing in my notes. Sad. It just sad. Yeah. I mean, sad to see all these characters who were, I think all three of those characters were strong characters, in prior to whatever disaster happened. Carolyn always had a lot of moxie. Carolyn, she's shattered. She is a shattered person. And Quentin, as you said, he was unflappable. He was always with some cutting witticism or something that he would throw out. And here's Quentin, who was like quivering in the corner, ready to slash his own Dorian Gray painting. He's and then you have Professor Stokes.
See the ugly painting before this, and we see the painting, but
we did see it. We saw it and during the Leviathan storyline, we got to see the Dorian Gray old man Quentin painting. I wish they had actually aged it even more for 1990, because it looks pretty much the same as it did in 1970 when you saw it. In that storyline, I wish they had made it look even nastier for 1995. I guess they would have had to paint over it again, so they didn't do that. But
they might, because then what if they painted over to make it look older, and then they go back to 1970 and they need to see it again?
Yeah, that's probably why they didn't do it, just in case. Although I don't think we did see it again, but they probably, that was probably the reason, though, in case we need to show this again, we can't age it up too much. I mean, it looks pretty horrible as it is, but and then Professor Stokes, as you said, he was brave. Like you said, he was always the first one if there was a supernatural threat, he's the one you go to for answers, to try to combat whatever. You think of the Professor Stokes who entered the dream curse willingly and confronted Angelique face to face. I mean, that was a pretty, I guess if somebody, I forgot who called it a boss move. Professor Stokes.
It's been several years since I saw the dream curse, but I remember everyone else, the doors open and then they lose their mind. But then doesn't Professor Stokes, the doors open, he sees whatever's the skull or whatever the thing is, and doesn't he say something like, "Oh, guess I'm supposed to be scared of this"?
I think he says something to that effect. He just does whatever he wants. He breaks all the rules of the dream curse. The doors. There's a knock on the door. He says, "No, I'm not going to answer." He just does whatever. He breaks all the rules of the dream curse, and thus causing Angelique herself to enter the dream curse, and then he confronts her and but now we have this like completely terrified Professor Stokes who doesn't want to talk about what happened at Collinwood. He doesn't want to go anywhere near Collinwood. He's avoiding Barnabas and Julia, and Carolyn too. She's like, she doesn't seem to recognize them. Then she does. She's also talking about like Mrs. Johnson brushing her hair when she was a child, but Mrs. Johnson wasn't at Collinwood when Carolyn was a child. Carolyn was already, it was 1966.
Time warp thing.
Yeah, maybe. I figured that's just because Carolyn's mad. She's just creating these false happy memories that don't exist. So mentally unstable Quentin Collins claims that Professor Stokes attempted an exorcism of Collinwood in 1970, which angered Gerard. And let's talk about Gerard. So we see these ghosts inhabiting Collinwood. We see the first one we see is Gerard Stiles, who was played by James Storm. He was great. He was very scary looking. That first shot you see of Gerard with that sneer on his face, he was just the master of the sneer, Gerard Stiles. But as we find out, there are layers to this character. This is sort of the first in a 3-part arc. The writers and Dan Curtis got to, like you mentioned, was this storyline supposed to be longer, and it actually serves as like act 1 of a 3-act story, because we get 1995, Then they go back to 1970 to try to stop what happens. They fail to stop what happens, and then they go back even further to 1840 to the beginning, and we find out that Gerard Stiles is in fact Ivan Miller, who was possessed by the warlock Judah Zachary. So I guess the ghost of Gerard is really Judah Zachary in the form of Gerard. Like you took on the physical form.
Why doesn't he look like Judah Zachary, like the headless?
I'm guessing it's because
we hadn't thought of it yet, probably.
What's that?
Because they probably hadn't thought of it yet.
No, well, maybe he probably wanted to have a nice head of hair. I'm guessing it's Judah Zachary is a very deceptive villain, and probably taking on the form of Gerard would confuse. They wouldn't know who Judah Zachary was. Angelique's hanging around Collinwood, she would recognize Judah Zachary, right? So maybe he's taking on that form of the person that he possessed in death, so that they will not point the finger at him. Like it'll be more difficult for them to discern who.
So it's now how many 100 years since, I don't know, 100-something years since the events of Judah Zachary and the headless body and this trial and all that. So why is he still hanging around Collinwood in 1995? I mean, he's just like, he's got a little eternity. I guess he's got nothing better to do, or does he sense when someone's around and then he kind of from the ether comes to scare them, or is it part of a grand plan? Or I'm just wondering, why is he there in the first place? Because he's done his damage, he's destroyed it. They've gone, family's either dead or insane. He's done what he wanted to do. So why still haunt the place?
Yeah, right. It's a good question. I mean, maybe he himself is cursed to remain there. I mean, something killed Judah Zachary when he came back and possessed Gerard in 1840 during the first run of events. He died somehow because something killed Judah Zachary. Even before Barnabas and Julia went back in time and stopped it from happening, something must have killed him the first time around. So maybe it was punishment for his. We know the Diabolos, the devil. He's fond of punishing his the witches and warlocks in his service. So maybe it was punishment.
That office with the desk and
yes, right, like Nicholas. Yeah.
I'm sending you back to Collinwood.
Like you screwed up. Yeah, you're stuck there for eternity. Maybe that was it. I mean, if anybody has theories about that, please send them in. I'm curious to hear. It could be something like that. So we meet him, and then we see the ghosts of what we think we see David, and it looks like David. They think it's David. It's actually Tad. Carolyn says it's Tad. So we have no idea who Tad is. This is such a strange period in Dark Shadows, because all of these look-alike characters take possession of their descendants and then they die, and the ghosts that are
not really Gerard, it's David, but not really David.
Carrie is not, or Hallie. We meet Hallie. Yeah.
Daphne, we don't know her. I think that's that's the first time we see Daphne in the story.
Yes, that's the first time we see Daphne too, because there's now this other ghost too that's referenced Daphne, and it's Kate Jackson, played by Kate Jackson, who of course went on to great fame with Charlie's Angels, but this was her first big role. It was on Dark Shadows as Daphne. I do agree with this, and particularly when we see it during the summer of 1970. They're doing the turn of the screw again. Which they did with Quentin and Beth, and I have mixed feelings about. What's that?
It's the second turn of the screw.
Turn of the screw. I think the blogger Danny Horn. He called it. The blogger Danny Horn called it in one of his entries. He called it the return of the screw, which I liked that. But yeah, so they're going for something like that, but there are other angles to it. What did you think of Gerard, the whole Gerard and Daphne thing?
Well, knowing where he goes, I mean, he's an interesting character later on. I feel like he has a very punchable face. Ghost shows up, I just want Barnabas to just punch him, and even Barnabas keeps mentioning he's arrogant. Julia's the one who says he's evil. They're trying to get something across in the writings. Barnabas focuses in on arrogance, and Julia says no, it's this overwhelming evil penetrating, and she gets the point across that it's like it's corrupting. not just like it's outside evil, it's like it goes inside of you.
Yes.
You. So they're trying to lay the groundwork for, I guess, the possession angle of Julie, mind control of Julie, and other characters in the future. But Barnabas, it's like he can't feel that.
Yeah.
He can't feel the evil. He's like immune to that.
Yeah. Well, he's a vampire. He can't, I mean, it makes it clear Gerard can't harm him or do anything to him because he's a vampire. So he's immune to whatever Gerard is.
The drawback, he can't feel this. Well, maybe it's not a drawback, but Gerard has this essence of evil that just permeate, and humans are like they're filled with it. But Barnabas, he has to hear from someone else. His impression is arrogance.
Yeah, and Gerard was maybe. I mean, Dominique Lamsey, who was on here during when we talked 1795. Her theory is that Gerard is a hybrid being between like Judah and Gerard merged. Maybe Barnabas is picking up on Gerard arrogance, and Julia is picking up on the heinous evil of Judah Zachary. I don't know.
When ghosts show up on Dark Shadows, always they're mute when they begin.
Yes. Yep.
They're always these mute characters, but usually they start as this sinister mute ghost, and then they turn into a likable human. That doesn't really happen with Gerard. I mean, he's got some sympathetic qualities, but he's always sort of a scoundrel even before.
Yeah, he's a scoundrel. I don't know if I would call him like a malevolent evil force like Judah is, but he's a scoundrel. I think that's a good way to describe Gerard. Yeah.
Maybe if they'd gone on another year or something, he would have come back. Quentin did. It's a more likable character, but he's never really the actor's likable in an entertaining way, but he's not a character that you really warm up to. The way that Quentin became, started as a ghost, was kind of a negative character, but became a positive, a likable character. That doesn't really happen for me anyway with Gerard. He's always sort of he's either the sinister ghost who's kind of annoying. I just want a little smirk. I feel like Barnabas, he's arrogant. I just want Barnabas just.
There are times I think toward the end of the series in some ways they kind of downplay the fact that Barnabas is a vampire, but I do like, just because you don't see him like feeding or anything, he's in 1995 for a couple of weeks, but hasn't bitten anybody as far as we've seen. But I do like that it does build up to this. Julia has fallen under Gerard's control, and against her will is Barnabas is almost destroyed by the sheriff. But then you end up with this battle of wills between Barnabas and Gerard, which I thought was pretty cool to see. I thought that was because then you see Barnabas sort of exerting some of his vampiric powers, and he does sort of say, Julia, look at
him to exert them more.
Yeah, a little bit more. We're punching in the face, Gerard.
Maybe it would have descended into like an X-Men kind of a superhero story, but I just wanted it. I always want, like, why doesn't, like, anytime Barnabas is trapped somewhere, I think, why doesn't he just dematerialize?
Right, or just yank the doorknob off the door and break through. I figured it's
strong too. Why would he be able to be chained or restrained?
Well, the chaining is, they always explain that with a cross on the inside lid of the coffin. Even when Joshua tells Ben to chain Barnabas in the coffin, he says put a silver cross on the inside lid of the coffin.
When he's walled up, he's walled up more than once, isn't he?
Barnabas? Not as a vampire, though. He's human when he's walled up.
He has above normal strength. He can dematerialize in one place and materialize in another place. He can turn into a bat. He can control minds. He can't quite read minds, but he's sort of mind melds a little bit. So he's got semi telekinetic power. He's got all kinds of powers, but he only uses them once. I guess it wouldn't be convenient for the story if at any point he really used his full power. It would end the story. So you have to kind of neuter him a little bit. But I do like the moments where, like we were talking about Parallel Time with Angelique, where he uses power.
Sure.
Well, you were saying something about him being a vampire, and like I think you were saying that when he uses his power, that's kind of cool. He's using his vampiric power, reminding you he's a vampire. I feel like the storyline, we were talking about the friendship versus romance. That's kind of one theme, but another thing I like is it's not real overt, but it's underneath there. This idea of Barnabas, his nature as a vampire, that no matter how good or heroic he might want to be, he is what he is. He's a vampire.
Yeah.
So he's a dangerous
yes
creature,
yeah.
even if he wants to be heroic, even if he wants to be just to save the day.
Yeah.
He can't help what he is. He's a vampire.
Right.
So, and I think that comes across like moments like when it seems like Carolyn has discovered his secret in the crypt, and he's questioning Carolyn.
It is a scary moment. Yeah.
Yeah, he's like kind of. It feels like he might fight her or kill her or something for a minute there.
Yeah.
Then later he's telling Julia he doesn't want to hurt her.
Yeah.
But kind of unsaid, it almost feels like what I would if I had to, or something like that.
Yep.
He doesn't say that, but it kind of.
Jonathan Frid was playing it that way. I picked up on that too. And when you talk about, it would kind of end the storyline. Like that's something I thought of too. With like with the door, not opening the door. Like I thought, well, Gerard is this super powerful warlock, the ghost of a super powerful warlock. So he maybe sealed the door with some supernatural element there. But with Carolyn, I said, well, Barnabas keeps trying to find out what happened at Collinwood from Carolyn, and she won't tell him. Why doesn't he use his hypnotic powers on Carolyn and get her to talk? Even he doesn't even have to bite her, but that would kill kind of.
Or doesn't he? He's going to do it or something. He never does, but I thought there was a moment.
He never does. I thought it's like you think he might, and he does look her in the eyes, but he could do that, and he doesn't. But that would rob Carolyn of that moment where she does find sort of her her old self. She realizes. There's a great scene with Jonathan Frid and Nancy Barrett where she's looking in the photo album and she can't recognize the girl in the picture, and he says, "That's you, Carolyn."
Very touching scene.
It's a great scene, yeah. And she does, after that scene, she does find the sort of the will to go to finally tell them what happened, and she goes to Collinwood, which is not the place where she should have gone.
Yeah, why all the places?
It's such a tragic scene too. They find Carolyn. She's there with the pen in her hand, and Barnabas goes over and she falls over, and Carolyn's dead. But she wrote down these 6 clues here about because they're trying to find out what happened at Collinwood. Nobody will tell them. Mrs. Johnson is now dead too. Gerard killed Mrs. Johnson, and Professor Stokes will soon be next to follow there. So it's like how
to be able to just like will people to die. He doesn't really have to do anything. He just kind of
he just
looks at them and then just kind of.
I think that's a ghostly power in Dark Shadows where they can cause someone to have a heart attack. Because Quentin did that with Ezra Braithwaite too, with Abe Vigoda's character. It just seems, but Gerard definitely. I mean, there's that scene with Stokes in the window, and Gerard just sort of does this thing with his hand, and Stokes dies of presumably of heart failure. So I think that's just some malevolent, ghostly power that they can cause someone. And Quentin did that to Madame Finley too, the psychic. When Professor Stokes had Madame Finley go to Collinwood, she also dies and falls down the stairs, presumably again some sort of heart failure. It scares them to death, I guess. Barnabas finds an incoherent note Carolyn was writing before she died. It details 6 events which herald the destruction of Collinwood: the night of the sun and the moon, the picnic, the unfinished horoscope, the night I sang my song, the destruction of Rose Cottage, and the murder. They're setting up this mystery here with these 6 clues here, which we will then see them completely fail to prevent from happening in the summer of 1970. It just sets up this really grim storyline in 1995. After Carolyn dies, Julia ends up alerting the sheriff, tells the sheriff that Barnabas is a vampire. Barnabas wakes up in the coffin with the sheriff holding the cross to Barnabas's face. And I remember one fan online, Barnabas ends up killing the sheriff. The ghost of Carrie Stokes appears, distracts the sheriff, and Barnabas throttles him and kills the sheriff. And so one fan online who was very I guess they were uncomfortable with Barnabas killing a police officer, I think is what it was, because they said Barnabas disabled the police officer. I was like, no, he did not disable the police officer. Well, I guess he permanently disabled the police officer.
There's a few things there. First of all, it's to back up a little bit there. That's another example of Barnabas being a vampire. There's also that moment with Quentin where Quentin grabs Barnabas. And Barnabas is like, "What will you do, Quentin?"
Right.
You know, there's and then the sheriff. There's these moments throughout where we're reminded Barnabas is a vampire. That if he has a survival instinct that's like he can't overrule that instinct. If you mess with him, he's going to kill you.
Right.
And so he might, it's like it's something he can't overcome or control. It's like if you try to kill me, you're going to die. And even if you're my friend or something, he's like he can't help that. It's like trying to be friends with a scorpion or a
right. But
snake. Doesn't matter how nice you are. Doesn't matter if they want to be nice to you. Just their nature, they're going to sting you.
But I love the line though when Julia, admits to having done that, and he says, "You've saved me so many times." He doesn't blame her for that. Barnabas in 1967 probably would not have been as forgiving.
As we set up, because they set these moments up where we see this vampiric Barnabas coming through, culminating in him killing the sheriff. It is all the more powerful that he doesn't hurt Julia. When she does, if he was almost going to kill Carolyn and Quentin and did kill the sheriff just over being kind of annoyed with him, and then Julia doing his betrayal, and then instead he like embraces her and he's willing to sacrifice himself for her. He's not going to let her go. That just makes that moment all the more powerful and shows just what a bond he feels with her. So I don't know if that was their intent, probably not, but that's kind of how I take it, that reminding he's a vampire, he might seem like a hero, but he's a vampire. And then at that moment he acts as a friend and a human and not as a vampire.
Right.
And I was surprised that he didn't actually bite the sheriff. In my memory, he bit him, but he doesn't. He just kind of strangles him or something.
Yeah.
And why does Carrie help him?
That's a good question. There seems to be, it seems like Gerard is kind of in control of all these ghosts who are haunting Collinwood. You have Tad and Carrie and Daphne, but they're also kind of working against Gerard at the same time. Daphne leaves that note, "She will die," which presumably is in reference to Julia. Like it's kind of like a warning, I think, to Barnabas about Julia. And then Carrie is trying to help Barnabas. Gerard killed them, or Judah/Gerard killed them. He murdered them. So maybe there's some like resentment in the afterlife where these ghosts are actively trying to subvert what Gerard is doing. They must know that Barnabas wants to help. Barnabas and Julia want to prevent this from happening. So maybe they're actively resisting Gerard's will and trying to undermine his attempts to keep them from doing that.
And I don't know what story Barnabas told Professor Stokes, because he tells Stokes that he killed the sheriff.
Yes.
I was like, oh, well, that was a drastic move.
Yeah.
Am I complicated in this?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
What did he say to him? Because he couldn't tell him the whole truth.
Yeah.
I would think that Barnabas, they never, because you've talked about this many times, they never let Stokes in on Barnabas. Quentin knows, and it's, obviously Lily knows, and some other people know.
I don't know how Stokes would react to that. I don't know if he would be okay with that, especially if he looks at what happened to all of the victims of Barnabas, or that Maggie Evans was kidnapped and locked in a cellar for several months. I don't know if Professor Stokes would be on board for that.
We see in the movie kind of how he would react.
Yes, right. So, and I always wonder, did Stokes figure it out, and then just kind of when he saw that Barnabas was presumably cured, maybe he was like, okay, I don't need to pursue this anymore. But in 1995, he doesn't seem to be aware of it. He at least doesn't let on, or he doesn't seem to be aware of it.
How did the coffin get in the mausoleum? Wasn't it in the old house? In 1970, isn't the Barnabas's coffin in the basement of the old house?
It seems like he has two, because sometimes they go into the secret room of the mausoleum and the coffin's there, and sometimes it's in the basement of the old. I think he must have two coffins. I mean, he must have two, because sometimes they'll go in there and there's a coffin in there. So, anyway, they have, of course, the way to deal with anything in Dark Shadows is with a seance. So they decide they're going to have a seance to try to communicate with Carolyn, who speaks through Julia, which Grayson Hall doing a Nancy Barrett impression. Thoughts on that?
So I love Grayson Hall, and I love her everything, which is her all over. Barnabas.
Yeah.
I'll give him a sedative. She gives Quentin sedative.
Several times.
So we get that too. But that moment, the seance, that was sort of like some of Quentin's insanity moments for me. That kind of it was a little unintentionally funny. Some of the way she was leaning back and I don't know. It was entertaining, but it was a little over the top. It certainly was. I mean, Grayson Hall's played some flamboyant characters on the show. She's not always just Julia. She's done some other flamboyant characters, but that one seemed like maybe it was crossing a line. That moment felt like maybe it was a little outside her wheelhouse or something.
Well, she was playing Carolyn technically. So that's, I mean, I thought it was fun.
It's fun, but I think it was somewhat unintentionally entertaining.
So we have the seance, with Stokes goes to the window, sees Gerard kills Professor Stokes. There's a connection between Quentin and Daphne too that's comes up, something with Quentin and Daphne keeps talking about her. And
back to the sanitarium, do they? Does the sheriff say he's coming to take him back or something?
I think he was. I know Quentin survived. I don't know if anything can really kill Quentin unless you destroy his portrait anyway. Julia gets taken to Collinwood. Gerard whisks Julia off to Collinwood. Barnabas heads over to Collinwood to the playroom, which we didn't talk much about the playroom, this mysterious room that didn't exist in Collinwood in 1970.
One thing with the playroom that I noticed that was interesting, every time they approach it, like in the hall, they approach the door, they have a canted angle, like
the Dutch angle. Yeah.
So, and that's not something you see very much in Dark Shadows. Everything is pretty straightforward in Dark Shadows. So I was wondering, what are they doing? Are you trying to suggest you're like entering another dimension as you approach this room? Because the room isn't always there. Sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not. Sometimes you open the door, it's a cupboard or something.
A linen closet, yeah.
So maybe it's not just the room, it's also outside the hallway. Outside there's like a time warp or an interdimensional warp or something. So they're trying to show, like, as you approach it, you're already kind of in an unreality.
And that's where Quentin's stairway into time will appear. So it's something, I think there's definitely some kind of time warping happening there for sure. And maybe that they do some interesting things like that in 1995, like the angle. Another thing we forgot to mention in terms of like time passing, like that they show of Collinwood at the beginning of every episode is a very dreary looking shot of Collinwood. It isn't the typical shot you see of the tower from the back. It's this other angle of Seaview Terrace, but it looks gray and there's a grim quality to it. So they do some interesting things like that in 1995, like that, and that Dutch angle thing. Just it's a disconcerting sort of angle that they throw in there. They also have the music, which we talked about. I think we talked about more about it before we recorded, but the music that comes from the playroom is a new theme that Robert Colbert did, of a tinkly, sort of innocent, childlike, but it's also, there's also something strange about it too.
You were saying you thought it was connected particularly with the carousel.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. In the summer 1970, we see when the carousel starts spinning around, that music plays whenever the carousel is spinning around.
Emanating, well, and under normal circumstances, it's emanating from the carousel, but now it's sort of disembodied from the carousel and it's sort of in the atmosphere.
It's in the atmosphere. Although Barnabas has a really strange line. I think this is one of the most bizarre lines in Dark Shadows, which is saying something. He says, music is rarely used to frighten. He said, what? What? First of all, what does that even mean? And second of all, how long you've been here for? How long I guess he forgot about Quentin's music, gramophone. Barnabas himself has used music to frighten. I remember he used music to frighten Julia when he was using cast that spell to get the ghost, make it look like the ghost of Dr. Woodard was haunting Julia in 1967. And I remember the piano went dun 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 dun, dun. Played the Sarah, London Bridge is Falling Down. I mean, Barnabas himself used music to frighten. So that's an odd thing to say, I thought. It was strange. I was like,
like writing the supernatural art of war or something.
Yeah, yes.
It's a rule. Music is seldom used to frighten.
Like, what?
Do as he says, not as he does.
Yeah, yes. Music is rarely used to frighten. Anyway, so the storyline wraps up with Gerard whisking Julia off into the playroom. Barnabas finally confronts Gerard, which I thought was a great scene.
But there's an earlier scene where Barnabas actually meets Gerard, right?
He did, yes. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. I think it was briefly, as I recall, it was a brief scene, but this is sort of the climax here because Julia has been whisked off, and Barnabas wants Gerard to leave her alone. Says he knows Gerard can't harm him, but Gerard kind of walks up to Julia and just touches her on the forehead, and Julia's dying now. So Carrie appears, the ghost of Carrie Stokes, walks into the wall, and this mysterious doorway appears, and the door opens, and there's a staircase there. So Barnabas and Julia walk down the stairway and disappear into time and go back to 1970 because of this talisman that was created by which we'll see Quentin's ancestor.
We get a good explanation for that stairway. Like, how did he make it?
He called it a metaphysical experiment. It's some kind of talisman that he constructed that enables one to transcend.
4 steps.
Yes. Right. I mean, we don't see him construct it, but it's some sort of mystical time travel staircase that.
Maybe it's just for budget reasons, but it's almost like, I mean, I would buy it if Quentin. Because what decade is that? Is that
1840? It's Quentin the First. Yeah.
Buy it if he was like an H.G. Wells character and he had like a time machine that he had developed and had some kind of quaint Victorian levers and something. But they don't go that way. They go to something more abstract and supernatural.
Yeah, well, that's with Dark Shadows. It's always they lean always more into the supernatural when it comes to time travel, even though it's technically, a sci-fi trope, but with Dark Shadows, it's through the lens of the Gothic, so they use more of a supernatural or metaphysical explanation for it, but they don't. I mean, they touch a little bit on it when he's describing what it is, but they don't. He doesn't go into any great detail about how he constructed this time travel staircase.
Now I'm getting off the subject, but his character in 1840. There's nothing else about his character. He's so pragmatic.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing else about his character that would suggest he would be not just dabbling, but going all in on trying to create a time vortex out of a stairway.
I mean, he's fascinated by the occult, which is why Desmond brings the head of Judah Zachary to him as a gift. He's going to the plan is to give him the head of, because he thinks Quentin's going to love.
You and I are fascinated by the occult, and so I have this and we're doing this, but I'm not secretly building a
no or are you? Don't go to 1995 though. That's bad news.
Oh, I was actually, here's the thing, we've actually been to 19.
Yeah, I know. Isn't that crazy? Isn't that crazy? It's
do that.
It's like, wow,
Yeah.
this is actually the past now. So okay, so I know you had a lot of notes on this, and I did too, and I don't know if we touched on is there anything you wanted to touch on in particular that we didn't touch on with regard to 1995?
Oh, I really liked the portrayal of Barnabas. I mean, I liked the relationship between Julie and Barnabas, which we did talk about, but I like that Barnabas is almost, and you mentioned he was something like he and Julie are almost like Holmes and Watson. In Barnabas is almost like a detective. I could imagine an entire series, not a storyline, but a whole series, like a multi-season series that was all just like this investigative.
Yeah.
Barnabas. I'm not saying I prefer that.
What
we have, no, but I'm saying it's an interesting alternate universe where you have a series about like a detective vampire with Barnabas, very serious, investigating, interviewing people, trying to research things and track things down. And he's always in his business kind of suit and tie. He doesn't have his cloak.
Yeah.
He doesn't have his cane, and he never bears his fangs. And even there's some scenes that are close on his face where I was looking at, he doesn't have the really overt dark.
Yeah, because usually when he's in vampire mode, he does have like a paler makeup with like dark around his eyes and stuff. Yeah.
But he is a vampire in this story.
Yes, yeah.
But he doesn't have that really not overdone, but in your face kind of scary makeup that he does. Even in other parts of the series, even if he's just standing around chatting with people, he has that makeup.
Yeah.
But not here. So looks very human, and he acts very human for the most part. We've talked about exceptions, but he's comes across almost like a detective character,
right?
Solving this mystery, which is, I don't think we've seen that before. He always, if he goes into another time or something, he's always has to kind of investigate, figure out what's going on. But they really leaned into that with this and pushed some other things out of the way, the more overtly horror-oriented stuff, to focus on the sort of investigator detective Barnabas that we hadn't seen before and wouldn't see again. Not really. I mean, he's always kind of doing stuff like that, but not like this. This is really leaning heavily into this investigative detecting, researching, interrogating, interviewing, probing kind of Barnabas. And they continue. And also one of the reasons I wonder, was this originally a longer story that got condensed? It seems like in the beginning, there's like this Lovecraftian things that cannot be mentioned angle, where no one will talk about things. They pretend that they've never heard of things that they have heard of, or they won't say a name, or they won't.
Yeah.
It's this weird. It is almost like a Lovecraft story where someone goes into a town and says, "I'm here to see the Baron, something or other, Count whatever, the owner." Then they're like, "There's no one like that here. Or, you can't mention that." Or they mention the name and everyone shuts up and won't talk. And it's almost like that, where it feels like there's like an unmentionable thing that's the whole town is in on this. It's almost like maybe a conspiracy or something.
Yeah.
And it doesn't pay off. It doesn't go anywhere with that.
Yeah.
It feels like it's setting up something, but then it doesn't pay off in 95, and it doesn't pay off later.
It's true. Yeah.
And I'm wondering, was that like the remnant of some longer story?
Well, it seems like they're setting something up that's so horrific that you expect to see like what actually happened here. And it turns out it was bad. It was, what actually ended up happening, but it was, Gerard killed everybody and summoned these zombies to come and wreck Collinwood, but
no one outside of Colin would have known about that.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Unless maybe the zombies started wandering around town after.
That's the thing. If zombies that would be cool if we learned that the zombies, after they were done with Collinwood, if there was more of them than what we saw,
and they just started
the town.
Yeah.
It was like a Night of the Living Dead thing in the town, but then it would have been national news. But they didn't go there. That would be, if somehow that happened and it didn't become international news and was localized, that I could see would be like a dark secret. But also you think like if they mention that something's going to happen, it's almost like there's a curse that they can't.
Yeah.
If they do, then something terrible will happen.
Can't speak its
And
name.
nothing, but it doesn't. Nothing like that comes to pass. Nothing.
Right.
Nothing like that is revealed.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering what was they thinking? It seems like they were thinking of something and then changed their mind or didn't have time to do it.
Yeah, it just feels like it's something so like demonic and apocalyptic. And I guess Judah Zachary could be kind of, there's a movie I think it was in the 80s, came out, Witch House, which is about the ghost of a warlock that possesses a house and ends up killing everybody. I'm like, I wonder if they got the idea from this. Probably not, but yeah, I don't know. It just seems like there's something like really dark and apocalyptic that took place here, and we only get little hints of it, and people are so terrified about what happened. And then 1840 doesn't line up with any of it either. We don't. The playroom doesn't. I mean, we see the playroom at the beginning of 1840, and then that's it. There's not really anything to do with Tad and Carrie. That not much, in 1840. So the Tad and Carrie figure prominently into this and into the summer of 1970, and then they're kind of on the back burner in 1840. So I don't know. I think everyone was kind of burned out too at this point in terms of there's great stuff in the last year. I love the last year of Dark Shadows too, but
I like the last few weeks of that 1840 storyline with Barnabas is acting as Quentin's lawyer, and he's
right, yeah.
And I know a lot of people complain about Angelique like turning good, and then Barnabas about to say he loves her. I like that. I mean, it could have been done a lot better, but it's sweet. I mean, it's romantic. I like that. I mean,
too. Yeah.
And I like that when Barnabas becomes human and then Angelique becomes human, there's like Barnabas is saying, like, if only you were human, like, hey, she just turned you human yesterday, but if only you were human, you could feel. It's like there's a thing, this acknowledgement that a monster doesn't have normal human feelings, which kind of is like what we're talking about 95, these vampire moments. If you're a monster, you can't feel like the way a human feels. So now Barnabas is human and he's got human emotions, and like Angelique is saying, why wouldn't you love me? And I was like, well, if only you were human, you would feel. Then she is human finally. And then they're about to finally have their romantic moment, and then Trask takes care of that.
Right.
So I like that. I like you were saying, I don't know, remember it was during or before the recording, that it would have been nice to have a wrap up of the series to back in the regular timeline. And we do, it's not what we would like, but we do kind of get that right before the 1841 parallel time. We get that little scene where they come back.
Elizabeth is there. Yeah.
And it's that's sort of the wrap up of the series. That it's nice. It's not what we would like. I would have liked something more drawn out and elaborate than that, but it is there. It's, to me, that is the conclusion of Dark Shadows. That's the conclusion of the storyline. And then we have this little spin-off series.
Kind of is like this little coda kind of thing that happens. I mean, I like 1841 parallel time, but it is almost like a spin-off, or it's its own on an island unto itself. But I like that they did the Wuthering Heights meets the lottery, and just the way they used the Shirley Jackson's lottery and kind of reconfigured it into this cursed lottery room that everyone has to spend.
Anything I wanted to say about 95, I just thought of something that
I
think I told you about this sometime in the past, that I feel like this might be a good introductory story if someone had never seen Dark Shadows. I feel like this might be a way in, like, okay, just watch these 10 episodes, or maybe the episode right before, to kind of get some context going into it, like the last episode of Parallel Time. But basically this 2-week period, it's got Barnabas. It establishes he's a vampire. It has him doing some vampire stuff, but it also has him, like we were saying, being an investigator, being a hero. It's got the relationship between Julia and Barnabas and the nature of that tension. But it has that arc of where it starts and where it ends. It's got supernatural foes. It's got a seance. It's got all kinds of stuff. It kind of showcases, even though it's so different from the rest of the series, it also showcases everything that kind of makes the series what it is. So even though it's atypical, it's also typical. So if you want it, it's like a capsulation of a capsule size version of what Dark Shadows is all about. And it's bite size. It's just these 10 episodes. You can watch them in a couple of nights, or just do like 2 a night for a week or something. And that might be a good introduction for someone who's never seen the show to get into it, because it kind of touches on all the things that makes Dark Shadows cool. It has the time travel, alternate universes, and it's got gothic, it's got modern, it's got so many things. It's got Quentin and his painting, etc., etc. All these different elements where if you took the introduction of Barnabas, that's a long story, and it doesn't have all the fun, like Jonathan Fred would call it the Brigadoon kind of quality. Sure. It's more of a horror story, like a Dracula story. Or 1897 is very long. That's a great story, but it's very long. It's hard to like jump into that and get a bite-sized part of that and really understand what's going on. And every other part of it, it's too long for a new fan if you're just trying to get them kind of a little taste to get into it. But this one is just 10 episodes, and it's a nice story that it kind of wraps itself up. It's going to go on like what's happening in 1970, but there is sort of a resolution. There's like a beginning and a middle and an end, and there's a self-contained quality to it. If you don't want to watch anymore, you're not completely left hanging. So I would, if I were going to try to introduce a new viewer to Dark Shadows, this would be a prime candidate for where I would tell them to start. Just watch this a little bit, and if you like that, then back up. I don't know if I'd say back up to the introduction of Barnabas, because I think that might take some dedication in the early months, maybe 1897, I don't know. But just see if you even want to watch the series, just watch these 10 episodes. And I think that's a good crash course in what makes the series what it is and why it has an appeal.
I think that's great advice. Yeah, I think that is a good, I mean, everything you said, yeah, it's a great entry point, and it's bite-sized, like you said. I mean, it's encapsulated, and it includes all of the elements of Dark Shadows that have became synonymous with Dark Shadows, except Angelique. It doesn't have Angelique, but it has, but it does have Quentin and Gerard. How many
episodes would you have to back up to get Angelique? Because she dies right before, like the previous.
Well, 18, yeah, not much longer. I mean, if you're going to parallel time, Angelique is not, a few episodes prior to that, or maybe just one or two. She dies close to the end of. That's what sends Timothy Stokes off the deep end when Angelique dies. So
yeah, so if you wanted to get Angelique, to back up a couple episodes.
There you go.
Now you got Angelique.
Yeah,
I don't collect autographs. But one of the few autographs I have is actually Jonathan Frid. And I was fortunate enough to actually personally get his autograph. So it means something. I mean, I could buy on the secondhand market a picture of him like that with the autograph. This is on a Fools and Fiends program, which is like just print, like his own Xerox kind of piece of paper, and it's on the cover. And I haven't looked at it in years and years. I'd have to dig a bit to dig it out. But it's it's on the cover of that.
Yeah.
So I went to like I saw the Fools and Fiends, and then I went to the reception after that. So he would do the Fools and Fiends, and then he would have like a meet and greet kind of thing afterward. So I went to that, and that's where I went up to him and talked to him and got the autograph. So that's one of the few times in my life where I actually met someone that I liked and actually got their autograph. I don't have a lot of autographs.
Me neither.
I don't know why. I don't, unless I get it myself. I don't really care about the autograph that much, and I don't go to like I kind of kick myself now for not doing it, but I could have gotten like George Romero's autograph or all these other figures that were at conventions that I was at. I remember being at conventions and George Romero sitting right there, and I love George Romero, but the whole thing seems so fake and contrived.
Right.
Standing in a line,
Yeah.
and going up to the desk and saying, "Oh, I really like your movies. Would you sign this? Okay, okay." What it feels fake. I don't feel like
I know what you mean. Yeah, I could
haven't met the person. If like after that evening of the convention, there was like a little get together and George Romero was there and said, "Oh, Raymond, come here. I'd like to meet George Romero." That's meeting him then.
Sure. Yep.
That's real. But the whole autograph things, I just don't like it. So I could have gotten a lot of autographs of these various people.
Sure.
No longer with us, but I didn't because it just felt that's well, I got what did his name is spelled German. I think it's Erman Robles.
Robles, the vampire, the Mexican vampire, El Vampiro.
Right. So I got his autograph, and it was at a Monster Bash. Maybe you were there.
I think I was there the year he was there.
Yeah,
I think so. Yeah.
In that case, yeah, it was at a table, but there wasn't anybody else there, so I was able to talk to him and stuff. And I did see him at like a party afterward, and got to spend some time, and so that was neat.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate having that autograph. So there's not that many autographs.
I'm the same way. I have a few, but I don't go out of my way to get them. I did get Jonathan Fritz the same way you did after Fools and Fiends. He had the little reception, and when I got him a little Shakespeare illustrated plays. What's that?
You brought him a gift.
I did. Yeah. My mom helped me put a little ribbon on it and things. So, and I brought a picture of him walking outside the old house. It was like a photo shoot they did at the.
I don't know what year would this be. When was this?
90. I want to say it was 91, 90 or 91.
Around the same time I did mine. Mm-hmm. So where did you get that picture at that time?
I was Brown. He was doing it at Brown University, and the picture I believe I got it from Pomegranate Press. I think I got it from Catherine Lee Scott. I must have ordered a book from Catherine Lee Scott's site, and it came with some pictures, but they were like printed on, not on photo paper. It was like a more flimsy paper material, like almost like I don't think they had laser printers. I don't know at that time, but it was kind of that. It was paper. It was, but it was. I still have that. He signed it. But I
used to get was it MPI back then? I used to get those mailers.
Yes, yeah.
The late 80s, early 90s. They would advertise Dark Shadows stuff, mostly the video cassettes, but they would also have, I think, posters, or they would have other things. Mm-hmm. But it was mostly the VHS cassettes at that time, or books. They would have books.
Yeah,
I would get they'd be like fold out little catalogs and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So that was just about the only visual material I had on Dark Shadows.
Mm-hmm.
So now, of course, it'd be easy to get all kinds of pictures and posters.
Well, you could get stuff through the fanzines too, but that particular picture I didn't get through a fanzine. I'm sure I got it through Pomegranate Press, because I remember it might have been when I ordered the Dark Shadows Companion, the hardcover version of the Dark Shadows Companion, which I think I ordered directly from Pomegranate Press, I think, because there were these like glossy, not photos, but printed on paper photographs. And one of them was Jonathan Frid walking outside the Spratt Mansion. And I brought that for him to sign. And he also signed an index card for me too. I brought both. I typically, I'm the same way. I don't go to a lot of people to get their autographs. I got the late Kevin Conroy, just passed away. He was the voice of Batman. I did get his autograph when I met him, because I really liked his Batman. I have a few people. I wrote to Billy Hayes to get Witchy Pooh's autograph through her website, the late Billy Hayes. There were a few people that Barbara Steele, I had a friend get it. I didn't meet her.
I got her autograph.
Yeah. You got her autograph. I didn't get to meet her, but Michael Joyner, who was a big Dark Shadows fan and a big classic horror fan too, he got Barbara Steele's autograph for me.
It was 2019, mm-hmm. And it was at Horror Hound, and it was at night, like Friday night. Mm-hmm. People are kind of still setting up. I think that the convention was technically open, but it was still sort of everyone was setting up. Mm-hmm. She was pretty much alone at her table, but she was still behind the table, so she was accepting people. And it was just like me and one other guy, and there's this guy that brought all this junk,
Oh gosh.
Yeah, and you know what Barbara Steele's personality is. You can
Yeah.
imagine what she was thinking. So he just sign this and sign this and sign this and sign this, and I was surprised she put up with them. I guess
Wow.
because there was nothing else was going on. She
Right.
was signing all that stuff, and then he left, and I was just like, hello, and I just wanted to meet her,
Yeah.
I said, I like an autograph, but I said I wanted it for someone else, not for me.
Mm-hmm.
I think she liked that. It wasn't
Yeah.
good, but she had me come back around, take a picture, and all that
Mm-hmm.
stuff. And someone else told me like, oh, she took off her glasses for you. I didn't know that was a.
That's great. There's a YouTube version of this, which you can watch the video version. It's going to be a longer episode on YouTube. The audio version is a little bit shorter because Squarespace does limit it to a certain number of minutes. Sadly, I wish I could do the whole thing on there. Maybe I'll split. What's that?
YouTube is the place to be.
YouTube's the place to be. Maybe I'll figure out a way to split this into
Danielle's beautiful face.
Oh gosh, geez. What a flatterer. What a flatterer.
I mean, if you don't see that, are you even watching the show? Come on now.
I'm 700 years old, Raymond. You're such a flatterer, though.
Day over 200.
Oh, shucks. So you can watch this on YouTube. But speaking of YouTube, Ray, why don't you tell us where we can find Raymond Castile's Basement of Horror and also any other social media presence that you have?
Well, if you go to YouTube, I think if you just Google Basement of Horror, I can't imagine you wouldn't. What else would you find? But you Google my name, Raymond Castile. It's RaymonDCastile apostrophe S. Basement of Horror, or just Google my name. I'm sure it'll come up. Go to YouTube. If you go to YouTube and search my name or Basement of Horror, it's got to come up. And then on my YouTube channel, I've got a series called Raymond Castile's Basement of Horror, and it's this set that if you're watching this on YouTube, you see it right now. And this is actually a basement. And this wood paneling is from the 70s. It's authentic 1970s wood paneling. And I've been doing it. I do it in seasons, as if it were a TV show. So I'm on my 5th season of Raymond Castile's Basement of Horror, and I talk about toys mostly, but some other things now and then. But like I'll have a topic. Like let's say I had Aurora models. I haven't done an Aurora model episode, but so this is an Aurora model. This is actually a vintage 1970s glow in the dark Frankenstein. So if this were an episode of my show, I would talk all about it. And when did they make this? And talk about Aurora and the company, and give you some history and give me some personal anecdotes about my childhood experiences with Aurora models. And I always try to personalize it and bring it back to me. Like my personal, not just here's this toy, here's this history, but what does it mean to me? How did it intersect with my life in some way? And also I play synthesizers. So there's a number of electronic music videos with me playing synthesizers. So if you're into that, if you don't care about toys and stuff, but you like electronic music, then there's some of that. And there's a little this and a little that. I've got a couple of short films and other stuff I've done on that channel. But right now, the main attraction is the Basement of Horror series. And also, if you're into masks, I have a series called Tomb of the Topstones, where I examine Topstone masks. It's like this right here is a shock monster. Topstone was this company based in Connecticut, operated from the late 40s to the early 90s, and they made all kinds of Halloween masks, rubber masks, some plastic masks too, but they're best known for their rubber masks, and all kinds of iconic Halloween characters that originated with them. And this series is looking at the various masks that they made and talking about the company history, like in the context of a particular mask, but then I open it up and talk about the cultural context of that character and the history of what was happening in the company when they made that character. So it's Tomb of the Topstones. If you're interested in Halloween or rubber masks, that's a separate series. So that's all the reasons you have to go to my channel. If none of that grabs you, then I don't know what to do. I could do some tap dancing videos. You wouldn't like it. I don't know how to tap dance, but I could try.
I don't know.
Whatever.
I request a tap dancing video. I love the synthesizer music that you have too that you mentioned on the video. It's just really cool. And I meant to ask you too, but we've gone on for a bit, but about the 91 series, because Robert Covert recreated a lot of his themes, but he did a synth soundtrack for the 91 series. Did you did you like that, or what were your thoughts on that?
Well, the series, I did watch that when it was new.
Mm-hmm.
And I liked it a lot. I haven't revisited it since. I watched it when it was broadcast.
Mm-hmm.
And I liked it a lot. And at the time, I thought, if you're going to bring back Dark Shadows, this is how you do it. I mean, I really didn't have any complaints. I can think back now and think, well, maybe Ben Cross, and I've heard the people say maybe he was a little too healthy looking or something.
Yeah, well, yeah, what he had like a tan. It was like an LA vampire.
And when I see photos of him now, at the time, I bought him.
Yeah, no, me too. Although I wasn't a big fan when he started wearing the turtlenecks instead of the tie, but I prefer the Barnabas in the tie, but okay. It's the 91 Barnabas.
Looking back at like photos and things now, I'm thinking, well, I don't know. But at the time, I totally bought him. And the music, I don't have the soundtrack for that 90s series. I have the theme. I think it's on a Robert Covert compilation or something. But I don't have a complete soundtrack album or compilation of all the music from that revival series. So I don't remember the music well enough to say, well, I like this and I didn't like it.
Yeah, it was like a synth. I mean, he did a lot of the classic themes. He did some new stuff too, but it was synthesizer.
I didn't like the way he did the main theme too much, because it had too much of a rhythm or something. And then at the end, he goes, dun, dun, dun.
Oh, right.
Yeah. It's kind of campy. And I felt like I like the more sort of free form original. It doesn't feel like it's really strictly on a kind of a metronome, on a grid kind of a rhythm. It's just kind of doing its thing. And I saw your music episode. You were talking about the theremin. So I got it wrong. When you said theremin, I said it wasn't a theremin.
You're right. It wasn't a theremin. Did you see the correction I issued after that?
Yes, but I would have made the further mistake that it was, what was it called? Ondus.
Oh yeah, Ondus Martinot. Yeah.
Martinot, yeah. That's what I thought it was that. I didn't know it was a Yamaha.
Yeah.
It wasn't a synthesizer, because Yamaha didn't make its first synthesizer in the 60s. They didn't make their first synthesizer until the 70s. So it was an organ. I haven't looked this up.
Yeah.
It was an organ of some kind. They had like a proto synthesizer type of thing on it, which is very interesting. I want to find out what organ that was, because I might want to get my hands on that organ. If it's not too expensive.
I quoted what he said in the liner notes, and I think he called out the name of it, but I have to look at it again.
I go back because I would like to. I mean, I don't know how much money it is. Organs are surprisingly cheap because they're so big. No one wants them because you can't move them anywhere. You can't get them out of the house. They're so hard to move that's hard to sell an organ. So it might be cheaper than you'd think, but I'd be interested in. It's something I need to go back and watch that and find out exactly what organ was that precisely. Do some research, because it'd be cool to have the actual instrument that played that thing.
Yeah, I dropped it.
You can't do that on a regular synthesizer. It just doesn't sound the same. So that's why I'm surprised that it was, because it's the way the portamento is acting. It's not like just having a synthesizer with portamento on it. It doesn't act the same way. It's more organic and more responding to each individual note a certain way, and it feels like it's more. That's why I could almost believe it was something where someone were manually controlling the slide up and down from each note. So I'm really interested in now knowing more about this organ.
Look at the YouTube video I put up, or I issued the correction after that episode. It's text, and it's just a quote from what he said in the liner notes for the Dark Shadows soundtrack CDs that came out. I've never heard it replicated. Anytime anyone has tried to replicate it, if you had the actual organ that he used, that would be amazing. I remember I had an organ when I was a kid. I think it was my uncle's or my grandmother's, and it was from the 60s, but you would turn it on. I used to play with it all the time. You'd turn it on and it would always have hum like.
Did it have a fan?
I don't know. I don't know if it had a fan inside or not.
As a kid, I had an organ. There's a certain kind of organ, I forgot the name, but it has a fan. When you turn it on, this loud fan starts, and then it has a certain kind of sound. Almost has like an accordion-like sound.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It was brown.
Yeah, that's a certain kind of organ. I've got a Wurlitzer organ that doesn't work anymore that my grandmother got me in the 80s, and it's an organ. It's not a synthesizer, but it hasn't worked in years, and it would be expensive to fix it. I mean, it's not really economically worthwhile to fix it. But it would be nice to get it working again. But I've never had an organ like the kind that apparently did the Dark Shadows thing.
Yeah. Did you say it was a Yamaha? I don't know. I'll have to double check.
I've got a Yamaha CS60 synthesizer, which is part of a family, includes the CS80, and then there were organ predecessors to that are like the ancestors of that sound. So I'm wondering if this organ is in that lineage, that family line that led up to the CS80 synthesizer and the CS60 like I have. Maybe, I mean, because those are they're known for their very organic, almost acoustic kind of a sound, and how expressive they are and how much control you have over each note, which fits right into the Dark Shadows theme and what that sounds like. Because it's not just ooh, it's not that mechanical, just sliding up and down. It's got this very ghostly, ethereal, organic sound that's just very expressive, and each note, the way it goes in and out of each note is very unique. So it has to be something that has this control note by note by note. I want to find this organ and see how it works.
Thank you so much, Raymond, for taking the time to sit down with me and hang out and catch up. It's been way too long since we've actually gotten to talk, except over Facebook.
See you in person at some point. I don't know when.
Yes, yeah. Well, we have
traveled in a long time.
I know, me too. I've started doing local cons again, but I'd like to head out maybe and do one of the ones, maybe Monster Bash again or Wonderfest. Those are the two I'd like to get back to. But thank you again for joining me, and thank you for listening to Terror at Collinwood. Again, if you're listening to the audio version of this, you're listening to a shorter version of this episode. If you want to see the full-length version with video, head on over to YouTube. Please do subscribe to the Terror at Collinwood YouTube channel or to the audio feeds on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, so that you do not miss a single episode of Terror at Collinwood. And thank you for listening.
And for as long as they lived, the Dark Shadows never truly vanished, for there will always be Terror at Collinwood. Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.